begun. He won't live to see its end. Thanks so much to Skillshare for helping to keep the history flowing. When police questioned Rasputin's would-be assassin, they quickly began to suspect that she'd been put up to the act by Iliador, a suspicion that only hardened once an informer told them that Iliador had paid the woman and tried to acquire explosives for a series of terrorist attacks. They came for Iliador at his home, but he fled via a tunnel, dressed as a woman. A month later, he was in Norway, writing a book about Rasputin called The Holy Devil. Meanwhile, Rasputin began to spiral. Already hounded by press and police attention, there was now the added stress of both acting as a spiritual advisor to a royal couple at war and the fear of assassinations. He started to become more the man his enemies made him out to be. Now, Rasputin had always had mistresses, and it appears he did sleep with followers and sex workers. But as the war continued, this got more brazen. The secret police logged him visiting sex workers, sometimes twice a day, and he openly propositioned society women. Also, while he as a pilgrim gave up alcohol, Rasputin resumed its use upon coming to court, throwing massive parties and starting to appear drunk in public. At one point, he became so intoxicated on a train that people could look into the window of his private compartment as he vomited, passed out, and wet himself. And while the most infamous stories about his behavior during this period are fabrications, the real stuff was bad enough. He also gained unprecedented political influence, since Nicholas was frequently off visiting the front, leaving Alexandra with few close companions she trusted for guidance. In fact, Rasputin was in the imperial couple's lives non-stop. He wrote Nicholas with advice, telling him to throw his weight around as monarch, and even proposing policy. He suggested, for example, to delay the second military draft until after the harvest to minimize the impact on peasants. But Nicholas disregarded Rasputin's advice frequently. For instance, when he chose to take personal command over the army, a move that went against Rasputin's advice to stay close to home. But to be fair, everyone knew that was a bad idea. Nicholas was already seen as weak and incompetent, and this would tie his reputation to a conflict that was, in every way, not looking good for Russia. Rasputin was far more successful exerting power through Alexandra, a power that mostly consisted of getting allies appointed to government offices and his enemies removed from them, sometimes for good reasons, like mistreatment of religious minorities, but at other times simply because someone's presence in power made Rasputin feel unsafe. And when opponents did cross it, he increasingly threatened to take it up with the Tsar. But the thing was, Rasputin wasn't losing paranoid. They really were out to get him. More press campaigns hit him in 1950, but this time with a new and dangerous element. The claims that he was a German spy, pushing Nicholas toward peace with the Central Powers. A particularly toxic accusation, given how he was now so associated with Alexandra, whose already low popularity had dropped even further due to her German heritage. One Duma member, Vladimir Purushkevich, went so far as to give a speech calling the royal couple marionettes of the evil genius Rasputin, and saying that Alexandra had remained a German on the Russian throne, alien to the country and its people. The speech was purposely incendiary. A year before, demonstrators had called to have Alexandra banished to a convent, and mobs had killed ethnic Germans in Moscow. Purushkevich was playing with fire, but a fire that drew others. Because after this speech, Purushkevich found himself approached by Prince Felix Yusupov, one of the richest men in Russia, who invited Purushkevich into a plot to kill Rasputin along with himself, an army officer from an elite guards unit, and Grand Duke Dmitry Pavlovich, the Tsar's cousin. December 29, 1960, Yusupov Palace. A cold night in St. Petersburg, a good night for a housewarming. And that's what Rasputin has been told this is. A celebration of the palace's renovations nearing completion. Prince Yusupov, a man who has come to him for healing, getting close to him for years, ushers him into a basement room with a gramophone playing Yankee Doodle over and over. Before dawn, Rasputin will be shot 3 times. That's the only thing we know for sure, because the only accounts of that come from people who have every reason to lie, to shift and spread blame, to make Rasputin out to be a monster whose killing was justified by his demonic refusal to let death take him. Prince Yusupov's account, the most famous, claims that he served Rasputin cyanide-laced cakes and tea. Yusupov says that he sat there in awe as Rasputin gobbled them down with no ill effects. Next, he says, he plied him with poisoned wine, which again did nothing. A man prone to believing in the supernatural, Yusupov began to panic. He says he went upstairs, got a revolver from other conspirators, and then returned, telling Rasputin to look at the crucifix before shooting him once through the chest. Stashing the body in the basement, the group dressed an army officer in Rasputin's coat and drove the man to Rasputin's apartment so witnesses would see him going home. Then they went to move the body. But when Yusupov lifted the corpse, it came alive. Rasputin wounded, clawed at his would-be killer, then scrambled to his feet and fled into the snow in the courtyard, the assassins following. And that is where Grand Duke Dmitri put him down with 2 shots, one point blank through the forehead. Then, with it perilously close to dawn, they dropped him off a bridge into a river through a hole in the ice. Now, it should be noted that historians don't generally believe Yusupov's account. It doesn't match up to the memories of other conspirators, and Yusupov himself had a lifelong fascination with theatricality, melodrama, and play acting. And there are plenty of other theories. But one thing most everyone can agree on: these guys were in no way professional killers. They'd never murdered anyone before, and because the post-mortem examination found no trace of poison, it's been suggested that Yusupov's supplier hadn't even given him real cyanide. Instead, the whole thing, from start to finish, seems like a drunken botch job by aristocratic flunkies. Alexandra insisted the plotters be shot, but Nicholas quietly transferred them to the front or confined them to their estates instead. And when word spread that the police had pulled Rasputin's body out from under the ice, people came to the river where they found him and scooped buckets of water as if it were sanctified. It was an expression of the old Russia, one that did not have long to live. For 2 months later, when winter food prices led to looting and police opened fire, riots broke out. The February Revolution had begun, and by March, Nicholas had abdicated and was living under house arrest with the provisional government in charge. In October, the Bolsheviks seized control. Of course, this would have likely happened without Rasputin. After all, with 1.7 billion Russians dead in the war, hunger throughout the country, and an aristocracy refusing to modernize, there were more than enough historical forces to drive change. But there's no doubt that Rasputin played a role, providing a concrete figure the opposition could rally against. And once he was removed, the criticisms he'd absorbed for years instead fell personally on Nicholas. In looking back, it's hard not to think of Rasputin as a figure of our modern age. One who, whatever the truth, had his public image defined through partisan press, conspiracy theories, and the distortion of fame. One whose memory could be defined by men like Iliador and Yusupov, who had both literally tried to kill him and then wrote books about him, casting him as a wicked advisor or fairy tale sorcerer who brought down a monarch. Ultimately, Rasputin serves as a warning against being seduced by a good story, one that's too cut and dry to be true, because history isn't like that. It's messy, full of contradictions, often told by people who are unreliable, deeply biased, or that don't know the whole story. And if those stories work hard enough, they can change a man in the eyes of history into one who never really existed. Which just goes to show you how powerful people's creativity can be. And on that note, I think it's time I checked out more courses from our friends over at Skillshare. For the uninitiated, Skillshare is an online learning community featuring thousands of inspiring classes for creators, letting you explore new skills and deepen existing passions. Plus, since Skillshare is curated specifically for learning, that means there are no ads like this one, and they're constantly launching new premium courses so you can focus on wherever your creativity takes you. Lately, I've been trying to figure out exactly how really awesome logos tick, and found the class by Aaron Traplin, Logo Design, Secrets of Shape, Type, and Color. Not only was it useful as heck, but it helped me get some ideas out of my head and into production. Another great course I clicked with was Creative Writing for All, a 10-day journaling challenge by Emily Gould, which taught me to notice new details I could use in my writing and really helped me get some ideas out of my head and into production. And since I'm always trying to utilize my time more efficiently, I turned to my old Nebula pal Thomas Frank and his productivity masterclass, Create a Custom System That Works, which not only helped me get hours of my work week back, but also really helped me get some ideas out of my head and into production more efficiently. Are you sensing a theme here? New show. Oh, sorry. Something in my throat. So whether you're a dabbler or a pro, a hobbyist or a master, you can discover what you can make with classes for every skill level, all for just $13.99 a month when you sign up for an annual plan. So if you want to get really creative with a sweet deal, the first 1,000 of you good beans that click the link in the description below will receive 1 entire month of Skillshare absolutely free. So you can learn something today you didn't know yesterday, all while supporting us at EC at the same time. Creativity for the win. That's right, Zoe. Ahmed Ziad Turk, Alicia Bramble, Casey Mustia, Dominic Valenciana, Joseph Blaine, Kyle Murgatroyd, and O'Reels1 are fantastic legendary patrons. Australia, October 1932. As Gandhi began his hunger strike and Hitler circled the chancellorship of Germany, George Pearce, Australia's Minister for Defence, was faced with two questions that would define his career. One, could a group of farmers from Western Australia get their hands on some machine guns? And two, could they shoot them at some emus? Now, normally, these weren't questions a defense minister would entertain. But this defense minister, at that moment in time, answered them with a quick and enthusiastic yes. He would be the first man in history to lead his country in a war against the emu. Thanks so much to Morning Brew for helping bring this history to life. Real quick up top, once again, please welcome our esteemed guest writer for this series from the super fun history podcast, Something True, Duncan Fife. Thanks for bringing the birds, Duncan. Strange as it might sound, until 1932, nobody ever really thought to fire a machine gun at an emu. I know, shocking. In Australia, the big bird even shares pride of place with the kangaroo on the nation's coat of arms. But the farmers of Western Australia's wheat belt soon came to see that heraldry as an insult, for it celebrated a loud, rabble-rousing pest that stomped their wheat, scared their sheep, and burst open holes in fences that let rabbits rush in to do even more damage. Though in fairness, what the emu saw was simply wide open spaces that were supplied with fresh water and plenty of wheat, aka the ideal migratory destination for the enormous avian. But let's take a step back for a minute and look at how these farms grew to be an emu's paradise. After the First World War, Australia made its returning servicemen a deal. See, it was sitting on 24 million acres of land, and it wanted to sell or lease that land to the returning soldiers, setting them up as farmers. One catch though, that land was awful. The scheme was designed in part to get somebody, anybody really, to settle in and harvest the most desolate parts of a very large country. Unfortunately, there was actually one more equally disturbing part. Of approximately 800 Aboriginal men who served in the war, only 3 had applications approved under the settlement scheme. In fact, some of the land was even taken from Aboriginal reserves. So, if you were an Aboriginal soldier, you actually had a better chance of losing land than gaining it. And you know, that's just something to keep in mind for later if you find yourself having a particular sympathy for men getting humiliated by birds. Just think back to this. But anyway, as we were saying, the land wasn't very good for Western agriculture. In particular, the small towns of Campion and Waggaman, 200 miles from Perth, were the toughest farmland in the country. There, every stalk of wheat that could be grown had to be grown. And not just for the farmers' own sake, because wheat was a major Australian export. It was a tough existence. And then, in 1929, came the Great Depression. Unemployment skyrocketed, and the government offered the wheat farmers a bailout by guaranteeing them a decent price on their crops. But then they went back on their word once the depression worsened. So the wheat farmers were losing their shirts. And despite multiple promises from multiple governments, assistance never came. In fact, they were so mad that they decided one day in 1932 that Australia would simply have no wheat at all that year. Yeah, they'd rather throw it all away than prop up a government that treated them so poorly. A standoff was coming, and it would have happened, except for one thing. Actually, more like 20,000 things. Emus. 20,000 rowdy emus had just made it and were ready to rumble. Hooting and hollering, they surged west in a feathery tidal wave right for the wheat fields of Campion. Now, if you happen to have never had the displeasure of an emu storming your wheat fields, here is what the farmers saw. The average emu stands 6 feet tall and stands for nothing.
Yo, weirdo.
Nothing, of course, but emu survival. They stay on the move in packs, scouring the land for resources like a marauding band of pirates, completely indifferent to the rule of law. And that's what makes them such a dangerous foe. You know, that and that they run incredibly fast, 30 miles an hour to be precise. They're lightweight, tough, and muscular, and are equipped with 6-inch razor-sharp claws on their toes, meaning they're deadly in a scrape and poorly suited for most ball sports. They thought the wheat fields were a wonderful prize, plenty to eat, and what they didn't take, they'd get to trample underfoot or poop on. A natural enemy for the farmer. And indeed, emus had terrified the wheat fields for years, and by 1923, farmers had successfully lobbied to have the emu designated as vermin, with the government subsidizing bounties for any hunter bringing home an emu head. But they had never seen emus in numbers like this before. 20,000? That was a national emergency, and the bounty hunters had not signed up to take down that many birds, okay? Fences couldn't keep them out, and while the farmers got off a few shots with their rifles, they assuredly weren't going to be able to fend off this foul force with such insignificant firepower. But, being ex-soldiers, they knew where to get some more. One of the most effective weapons of the First World War was the Lewis gun, a light machine gun that shot 550 rounds a minute with an effective range of 880 yards. It was one of the greatest machines of modern warfare, a potent symbol of man's increasing power of destruction, and just the thing to put down a flock of birds. Huh? But to get their hands on these guns, a coalition of Campion wheat farmers made a direct appeal to the Minister of Defense, George Pearce, who was also, importantly, an elected senator for the state of Western Australia. Pearce, like anyone whose career depended on the voters of Western Australia, was very preoccupied with thoughts and fears of secession. Although the federal government of Australia was only 30 years old, the state of Western Australia had for some time been agitating to leave, believing that the state, its people, and their interests would be better served by self-governance. So, the Depression had dealt the state massive economic damage, and this unhappiness fueled an organized secession movement that was fast building toward a referendum on independence. And that was something Pearce was actively campaigning against. Also, Pearce was well aware that the government had failed to give any meaningful financial aid to the wheat farmers of Western Australia after putting them there in the first place. But with this overture from the emu distressed farmers, he saw that what he could offer, and what might earn him just as much political goodwill as money, was a really big gun to shoot some emus and save a union. And if nothing else, remember this, because it's an important lesson in the workings of democracy. If there are enough votes in it, the government will let you kill any bird you want. Now, Pearce had no way of knowing if it would be effective to turn weapons of war on a rampaging horde of emus. I mean, it had never been tried before, and a machine gun is not the emu's natural predator after all. But given the opportunity, Pearce was eager to provide a show of force, a dramatic and undeniable demonstration of his party's friendship with the good, hard-working constituents of Western Australia, although he wasn't going to pay for it. So here's the deal Pearce struck. The farmers could have the benefit of 2 machine guns, but those guns could only be used by soldiers from the Royal Australian Artillery. The state government would have to pay for the transport of those guns, and the farmers had to arrange for the soldiers' accommodation and food. Meaning, it was an official military operation at a price, but one the farmers were willing to pay. The emus, by contrast, unfortunately weren't able to earn or really understand the concept of money, which did put them at a significant disadvantage in the brewing conflict. Pearce sent the farmers of Campion 2 Lewis guns with 10,000 rounds of ammunition, and those guns were under the command of Major Gwynedd Meredith, who was supported by 2 other soldiers, McMurray and O'Halloran, plus, usually, a cinematographer. And you know, that Pearce thought to insist on a cameraman does reveal how much he considered the mission to be a political opportunity. Because, I mean, think about it. What economically depressed farmer in Western Australia would ever vote to secede after seeing wonderful footage of a soldier murking an emu with a machine gun, right? That's political gold right there. Meredith and his men set out for the front lines in Campion, confident of success. So confident, in fact, that they left with an order from their comrades in the Army's mounted infantry units to collect 100 emu skins to make stylish feathered hats for the officers. And come on, why would they not be confident? Why wouldn't they be able to come home with nice new hats? The Australian Army had helped win a world war, so really, what were a few thousand birds? The wheat farmers, George Pearce, Meredith, and his men. They all assumed that the emus would be easy pickings. But on the day they arrived in emu-occupied Campion, massive guns in tow, they had no idea of the painful lesson they were about to learn. That when you assume, you are made an ass by an emu. Of course, you can see why this version of the saying never really caught on, because generally sayings don't require diagrams, but you get the idea. Stuff's gonna get real next episode. I cannot wait for you all to see it. But until we get to release round 2. Western Australia, November 2nd, 1932. For months, the soldiers turned wheat farmers of Campion and Wagyu have suffered the depredations of the terrible emu. After a vigorous mating season, the gangly, rambunctious birds had migrated west, dashing their massive bodies against wire fences until they fell, then trampling the precious crops under the ecstatic dance of their sharp claws. With conventional methods of bird deterrence failing, the farmers found themselves chasing down flocks of emus in their cars and on bicycles, waving sticks at the birds, who were so gleefully wiping out their livelihoods by spraying urine across hard-grown rows of wheat. But there were so many emu, and they were so fast, all seemed lost. That is, until a transport came over the horizon, carrying 3 soldiers from the 7th Heavy Battery of the Royal Australian Artillery and 2 mighty machine guns. Ah, yes! The farmers rejoiced. Perhaps they had lost the emu battle, but today was the dawn of the emu war. Thanks so much to HelloFresh for continuing to help us bring history to the table. At 45 years old, Major Gwyneth Meredith had seen some action, but not often against birds. Compared to the violence of the Great War, he considered this campaign more like a zoo visit. And it's fairly easy, though not pretty, and, let's be honest, basically a dick move for a machine gun-toting soldier to shoot animals at a zoo. Meredith's plan was to herd the emus together for quick killing, because while his Lewis guns were powerful, they were cumbersome and not easily mobile. So with the farmer's help, he and his 2 soldiers attempted to shepherd a couple dozen emus into range of the guns. But the birds were not so easily corralled. Chased by Meredith, the flock split into smaller groups and fled, running away at 30 miles an hour. This might be harder than he thought, but surely not harder than fighting an enemy battalion or an aircraft. The targets these guns were designed to shoot. These were birds, and the bigger the bird, the easier it should be to hit with a machine gun, right? Well, most folks thought so anyway. In fact, Meredith's superiors, right up to the Minister of Defense, had been so confident in the success of the mission that they'd sent a cameraman to capture propaganda footage of the culling and a request for 100 emu skins to make nice new hats for the boys back home. Thankfully, the following 2 days brought better luck. Meredith's guns downed a couple of targets, though this made no difference to emu morale, and the birds continued their devastation of the fields. Seeing this, Meredith had an epiphany. If he was going to deliver on expectations, he needed to start making bigger moves. So he planned an ambush at an emu watering hole. And this time, 1,000 emus walked into his trap. But when Meredith gave the order to fire, the machine guns jammed. Good thing the camera crew was there. By the time they cleared the jam, engaged the enemy, and held their breath for the dust to settle, the vaunted tools of modern war had killed only 12 emus. More were wounded, sure, but undeterred by the bullets lodged in their surprisingly tough hides, most managed to escape. Meredith couldn't believe how much punishment an emu could take without going down. If we had a military division with the bullet-carrying capacity of these birds, it would face any army in the world, he said. They can face machine gun fire with the invulnerability of tanks. Then the farmers shared their own hard-won wisdom. There's only one way to kill an emu: shoot him through the back of the head. But Meredith would have to catch them first. Giving up his ambush tactics, he mounted a gun on a truck and chased the emus down. But the birds were still faster, and the ground too bumpy for the gunner to shoot with any accuracy. Also by now, the birds were keeping to smaller groups, almost strategically, almost as though they had a leader. In each pack, the soldiers observed a, quote, big black plumed bird, which stands fully 6 feet high and keeps watch while his mates carry out their work of destruction and warns them of our approach. And it was at this moment of despair, a moment in which one comes to believe in the existence of an emu commander and intelligence chief, that Meredith and his men were ordered back home immediately. Just as things were getting worse, and the emus were descending in greater force upon Campion, had mighty Australia surrendered. Meanwhile, in Parliament, members had been asking the Prime Minister uncomfortable questions, like was an emu war really the best way to deal with a pest control problem? Who was paying for it? Oh, and also, wasn't all of this just incredibly silly? Yes it was. In Parliament, the opposition called it a farce, and the press reported that the emus were more than holding their own in the war, which I think we can all agree is a very bad look. So George Pierce, the Minister of Defense, officially declared the emu war over, with only 300 birds dead. Turns out nobody in the army would be getting any new hats after all. This decision, while politically expedient, was terrible news for the settlers of Campion and Wagram, whereas the emus, now emboldened, continued their ravages. So once again, the farmers begged for assistance, dispatching urgent telegrams from the very much still active battlefront. Emus beginning reappear large numbers, wired one farmer in Campion, and from Wagram. We urgently desire Lewis gun crew to assist here. Enormous number of emus doing untold damage. All right, back to square one then. Almost. Because what the farmers had now was an ally, a convert in Major Gwyneth Meredith, for he had been transformed by what he'd seen in the West. The damage done by these birds has to be seen to be believed, Meredith protested to his superiors. Sitting behind one's desk, he said, one could not imagine the horrors of the emu war. The birds were nigh invulnerable and poised to bring Australia to the brink of agricultural catastrophe. They needed to be stopped. He needed to stop them. And so, in the interest of agriculture, Pierce agreed to redeploy Meredith and his men to the front lines, in an attempt to bring an honorable end, once and for all, to the emu war. November 13, 1932. Many men fear emasculation, but few know how it feels to be emasculated by an emu, that is, emusculated. Meredith, by contrast, had been emusculated hard by the big birds in a theater of war, so now his response was to drown the desert in blood. His first attack, Meredith killed 40 emus, and by December, he and his men were putting down 100 a week. As he did, George Pierce was asked in Parliament, was there not a more humane method to cull the troublesome emus? Poison, perhaps? Maybe stronger fences? To which Pierce replied that he thought machine guns were pretty humane. On December 10, 1932, they declared their mission accomplished. Meredith and his soldiers returned home in triumph, claiming to have killed 986 emus, with a further 2,500 mortally wounded. The emu war had been won by the humans. Australian humans. I mean, who's to say how any other nation would have done? And yet, once the belligerence and bloodlust had diminished with time, people still did think, you know, that was very silly. And George Pierce's enemies never let him forget it, calling him the Minister for the Emu War, even as he specifically never brought it up again. There are many officials and experts who can't bear to be reminded of some of their more ambitious efforts at emu destruction, wrote Sydney's Sunday Herald years later. And sure, it's embarrassing to be shown up by a bunch of emus, but maybe it's more embarrassing to get so worked up about it that you try to drive an entire species to near extinction with high-caliber automatic weapons. Or was the most embarrassing thing of all that it wasn't enough? The emus returned time and time again to Campion and Wagram, their feathers laden with lead, but figuratively unruffled. And when the farmers petitioned the government for another emu war, the answer this time was no. Not a problem, the farmers said. What if we just drop bombs on them instead? You know, like from up. Again, a hard no. Unwarranted was the word they used. So in the end, nobody got what they wanted. By supporting the emu war, George Pierce had hoped to quell a secession movement in the state of Western Australia. But in 1933, the state went ahead and voted for it anyway, only to be told by the United Kingdom that secession was illegal. And shortly thereafter, Western Australia voted Pierce out of his Senate seat. And in just a few decades, neglected by central government, the towns of Campion and Wagram withered up and died. Campion today is a ghost town. No wheat, no farmers, no soldiers, nothing. Well, except maybe you'll see an emu or two. A little slower now, you know? A little grayer. Just pecking and peeing at the lone desert sands where there was once a town. One can only imagine a single thought crossing their bird brains. Heck around and find out. But don't worry, fellow human. Just because the birds won the emu war doesn't mean we're any lower on the food chain, which I was just reminded of when I took a look at the delectable dishes from our friends at HelloFresh. Too soon? You know, I'm sorry if I sound like a broken record at this point, but I love that HelloFresh sponsors our shows because they've been saving me time and keeping me way less angry for ages now, all while eliminating tedious trips to the grocery store and stressful meal planning. I get everything I need to prepare delicious meals all delivered to my door, and I am eating in a half hour or less. It's like the perfect effort to ease ratio. This week, I was pumped to cook and try their pork bulgogi bowls, not just because that's fun to say, and I gotta tell you, they were awesome. Plus, now that Zoe and I basically have weaseled our way into a standing invite for second dinner over at Jeff's, we got him to permanently up his plan to include more servings, which this time around was the special sauce house burgers. That's a win! You know, technically I think it's thirds at this point, but I digress. Tastiness aside, another thing that keeps me feeling great about HelloFresh is their continued work on the sustainability front. Ingredients are pre-portioned, which means less food waste, and the carbon footprint of their service is actually 25% smaller than that of meals made from store-bought groceries. And now is a great time to try HelloFresh for yourself with this delectable deal. All you gotta do is go to HelloFresh.com and use the code EXTRACREDITS14 to get 14 free meals, including free shipping. And you know what? I'm just going to say that again in case your stomach was growling too loud. You can get free food while supporting the content you love, the environment, and most importantly, your grumbly dump. Again, that's 14 free meals at HelloFresh.com using the code EXTRACREDITS14. Your time and taste buds will thank you. And as always, so will we. Thanks. That's right, Zoe. Ahmed Ziad-Turk, Alicia Bramble, Casey Mustia, Dominic Valenciana, Joseph Blaine, Kyle Murgatroyd, and O'Reels1 are fantastic legendary patrons.
Welcome to Big Tobacco's Fantasyland, a calmer and stress-free world. I want you to believe vapes are soothing. If soothing means amplifying anxiety and depression, but you won't give it a second thought.
Calcutta, June 20th, 1756. It happened again. The EIC stepped over the line, and the local Indian ruler, in this case the Nawab of Bengal, has responded by capturing another British fort in another factory city. And just like the siege of Bombay, the Indians hoped to make an example of the EIC. So the Nawab's men stripped the surviving British soldiers naked and locked them in the fort's prison, a 14 by 18 foot room referred to as the Black Hole. British survivors claimed that 146 prisoners were crammed inside at the same time and were held there, suffocating until the next morning. When the prison door was opened, only 23 men remained alive. Given the EIC's history in India, the story of the Black Hole of Calcutta is a familiar disaster. Yet what makes this instance different was a bit, managing to hold on to their coastal factories, the most important of which included Bombay in the west, Madras in the south, and Calcutta in the east. There, they generated a few million pounds of revenue each year through the exports of textiles, sugar, indigo, pepper, and saltpeter. However, much of this revenue was eaten up by the high expenses associated with combative trade located halfway across the world. So to compete with the VOC and other European trading companies, the EIC began to adopt a militarized corporate structure and build a fleet of East Indiamen sailing ships that combined speed, storage, and heavy armor.
Sup, lads. Starting today,
this impressive
you're in charge
fleet
of
was
defending this village
supplemented
from
with
monsters.
small armies made up of local mercenary soldiers
These
trained
monsters are
in
able to
European
disguise
style
themselves as humans.
called sepoys.
Okay,
Their
so they
disguise is
got
not
the
perfect
money,
yet.
they
If you
got
see
the
something
ships,
weird like this one,
they got the soldiers. This
don't
is where the
hesitate to shoot them.
conquering starts, right?
Civilians come in the day,
Well,
at night.
not
Be careful
exactly.
and retrieve the monsters'
you see,
bodies.
Even here, with this success, we run
Sell
the
them and
risk
buy ammos
of
and gears to
jumping
improve
the
your defense.
conclusion without considering the context.
I'll go ahead and bring reinforcements.
Remember, at the
We will
beginning
arrive in
of the
10
18th
days.
century, the Mughal Empire's
Good luck,
power
soldiers.
was
Always
still
remember,
at its zenith,
don't let them
holding
down.
sway over the subcontinent with armies that numbered in the tens of thousands. Also, we can't forget that the British at the time were still just one of many European states in the area. Case in point, consider the French, who entered the subcontinent scene at the end of the 17th century. At this moment in history, France is arguably the most powerful nation in Europe, but had a lot of catching up to do in terms of colonialism. Yet by the 1730s, the French, through their company the CIO, maintained revenues on par with the EIC, despite being in India for less than half the time as the British. So how did Britain go from being the underdogs to a foregone conclusion? Well, under the rule of Emperor Aurangzeb, the Mughal Empire reached its greatest size and strength, a state that stood shoulder to shoulder with the greatest empires the Western world had to offer. But it had one fatal flaw, which was hard to see in the 1700s because it was also the empire's greatest strength.
And here come the paradoxes, right?
Ding, 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 ding! Now you're getting it, Army! Aurangzeb and his ancestors built the Mughal Empire in a way very similar to the Mongol Empire from which they emerged. In this system, the Mughal emperors delegated much of the day-to-day rule over their huge empire to various local potentates, while they maintained control over big questions like trade and foreign policy. The emperor would then provide military force and basic infrastructure to local leaders in return for consistent tribute payments, nearly always drawn from taxes on land. And those land taxes were the secret sauce of the Mughal Empire. Thanks to a huge population of cultivators paying taxes every year, the Mughal emperors possessed a constant and often expansive stream of cash. So, what could mess up this reliable system that's been doing quite well for the Mughals for a couple of centuries? Oh, hi European trading companies and privateered armies! Didn't see you there. These new corporate armies weren't interested in taking on the Mughal Empire. It was just too big and strong. Their main purpose was to protect European factories from other Europeans. But when they weren't busy fighting folks in their neck of the woods, these corporate armies were often rented out as fighting forces to local Indian leaders to make some extra coin. And these corporate sepoy armies offered a lot of advantages for local potentates. They were stationed close to their fiefdoms, made up of local troops that knew the land, and could be used without having to ask for help from the Mughal emperor. I mean, why travel all the way to the Mughal brick-and-mortar mercenary store when you could use EIC Prime with 2-day Soldier of Fortune free shipping? What could go wrong? Now, the Mughal Empire might have been okay with this situation, had they maintained their strength at a continental level. However, in 1707, Emperor Aurangzeb died and was replaced by a successive chain of ineffective leaders. This period led to a series of small wars between rival local rulers that in centuries past
starting today
would have been
you're in
snubbed
charge of
early
defending
by a
this village
strong
from
Mughal
monsters.
emperor re-establishing
These
order.
monsters are able to
But that
disguise
didn't
themselves
happen
as
in the
humans.
early 18th century. And
Their
gradually,
disguise is
over
not
a
perfect
period
yet.
that
If you
went
see
on
something weird like
decades,
this one,
local leaders began only paying lip
Don't hesitate to
service
shoot
to
them.
the emperor while they
Civilians come in
formalized
the
their
day,
own
at night.
independent
Be careful
rule.
and retrieve the
A rule
monster's
that
bodies.
was built upon European-trained
Sell
mercenary
them and buy
armies.
ammos and gears to
By the
improve your defense.
1740s, it was clear that this
I'll go
situation
ahead and bring
would eventually
reinforcements.
spell
We will
doom
arrive
for
in
the
10
Mughal
days.
Empire. But what was funny was
Good luck,
that the
soldiers. Always
European
remember,
companies that
don't
were
let them down.
indirectly involved in this destabilization of the Mughal state weren't completely aware of their newfound power. Because from the perspective of the Dutch, the French, and the English, the main enemy was still each other. In fact, the thought of taking over for the Mughals only occurred by happenstance in Bengal. By the mid-18th century, Bengal had become the most important region in the subcontinent for the EIC, because it made up 75% of all of the EIC's exports and possessed abundant natural resources, a huge labor market, and a sophisticated merchant class. Consequentially, the British were incredibly eager to protect this golden goose, and they did so by building up their military forces and defenses in the region. The purpose of this military buildup was to protect the region for the EIC from the French. But in 1756, the Nawab of Bengal, Suraj-ud-Dowlah, objected to this because it risked war between two foreign armies in his homeland. After the Nawab expressed his displeasure, the French agreed to draw down their forces. But the British, fearing the French, decided to continue. So the Nawab responded by laying siege to the EIC factory of Calcutta, which led to the famous Black Hole incident. Now, in decades past, the British would have taken the L and asked for forgiveness. But the story of the Black Hole became fodder for sensationalist retellings throughout British India and Britain itself. And with each new story, the Black Hole became darker and holier. For the British, responding to this incident wasn't about exerting control. It was about carrying out justice. An EIC force was dispatched from Madras in 1757 under the command of Colonel Robert Clive. Upon arriving in Bengal, this force was bolstered by men and funds supplied by local merchants who valued their relationship with the EIC and were eager to see the Nawab not only punished for the Black Hole, but removed. And on June 23, 1757, just over a year after the whole Hole incident, Clive's numerically inferior but well-disciplined force defeated the army of the Nawab of Bengal at the Battle of Plassey. A week later, the Nawab was executed and replaced by a series of new Nawabs that the British hoped would funnel funds their way. Eventually, however, these new leaders bristled at the EIC's incessant demands for cash, and in 1764, the then Nawab of Bengal, Mir Qasim, allied with the Mughal Emperor Shah Alam II to try to oust the EIC from the province for good. But the company decisively defeated this combined force at the Battle of Buxar. Then, fearing that this defeat would lead to the collapse of his empire and hoping to secure British protection, Shah Alam offered the EIC the most valuable thing in his kingdom, the Diwani, the right to be the emperor's official revenue collector in Bengal, Bihar, and Orissa. In this way, the EIC went from being one of many companies linked to the subcontinent to being the first European landlords in India. And it's at this point that we'll ask you all to put your anthropomorphic armchairs in their full and upright positions, because things are about to get rough. Okay, maybe we were phoning it in a bit with that last armchair joke, but what better way to do a seamless transition into talking about our friends at the new and improved Ting Mobile? See what I did there? High five! No? Okay, moving on. What we love about Ting is it's got a plan that can work for anybody on any budget. For instance, if you just need unlimited talk and text, then they've got you covered for only $10 a month. Or depending on your data needs, Ting has plans starting at $25, all the way to the mighty unlimited talk, text, and data for just $45, meaning there's a perfect plan for you and your family. And speaking of families, it's that time again, Jeff. Since you switched to Ting 8 months ago, how much have you saved on your fam's 2 phones and an iPad? Over $620? Dang, that's really gonna help out with your holiday shopping this year. P.S. I think you already know what I thought. What's really neat, though, is that the only thing that actually changes is you getting a lower monthly phone bill. You still get robust nationwide LTE and 5G coverage, not to mention access to Ting's award-winning customer service, plus no contracts ever. And switching has never been simpler. Just head to extracredits.ting.com to check your phone's compatibility, create an account, and pick the plan that's right for you. Not to mention, if you bring your phone, you'll get a $25 service credit to try Ting with no strings attached. And because using our link, again that's extracredits.ting.com, helps support the shows you love while biting off a big chunk of your phone bill. There really has never been a better time to try Ting for yourself. Thanks so much. That's right, Zoe. Ahmed Ziad Turk, Alicia Bramble, Casey Mustia, Dominic Valenciana, Joseph Blaine, Kyle Murgatroyd, and Oreos1 are fantastic legendary patrons.
Choose to lean into it. Every Mazda is engineered to give you effortless control.
I wake up.
Westminster Hall, February 13th, 1788. The House of Commons, the House of Lords, members of the royal family, foreign dignitaries, historians, and socialites are packed into the Palace of Westminster. But they aren't here for a monumental vote, or a declaration of war, or even a coronation. They're here for an impeachment trial. The defendant is Warren Hastings, who until recently was the East India Company's top man in Bengal. He stands accused of a litany of crimes, including embezzlement, extortion, dueling his political rivals, and the illegal killing of a Maharaja. And leading the prosecution against Hastings is the so-called father of modern conservatism, Edmund Burke. Hastings' alleged crimes were so numerous that it took Burke a full 2 days to introduce and explain each of the charges. And the trial itself eventually required 148 days of meetings over the course of 7 years. Sounds excessive, right? Well, consider this. What was at stake wasn't just Warren's reputation, but rather the past, present, and future of the British Empire in India. Thanks so much to CuriosityStream for helping us tell today's historical tale. Thanks to the Diwani, the East India Company had become the de facto rulers of Bengal. And this change was so sudden and unexpected that it represented a real-time paradox for the people of India and Britain. In India, they described the event using the Persian word inquilab, which translates roughly to topsy-turvy or a surprising inversion of the existing order. As one Mughal poet put it, the revolution in Bengal left those who rode elephants as beggars in the streets, while it elevated the beggars into palaces. The British were equally caught off guard by these events. Most of Britain's attention in the 18th century had been focused on Europe and America, and now they turned around in 1765 to discover that the EIC, the company that was always on the verge of going bankrupt, now controlled a region with a higher population and landmass than Britain itself. And it's important to remember how the company gained this power. On its surface, the EIC was a trading company. But in reality, it had become a private security firm that operated a bit like the mafia. They built up their paid sepoy armies, sold protection to the highest local bidder, and when those customers couldn't pay, the EIC demanded, and usually got, taxation rights. Why, good sir, what a fine and majestic subcontinental region you have here. 'Twould be a pity if something were to happen to it. The EIC could use said taxes to build up their military power and force their way into new territories, thus increasing their profits. And in the words of one EIC officer, the EIC eventually destroys every government that it seeks to protect. How's that for a paradox, huh?
Okay, so this is a paradox. I get that. But if it wasn't a parody at the time, why didn't anyone do anything about it?
Oh, a lot of people tried, especially in India. As you know, there were the combined forces by the Nawab of Bengal and the Mughal that ended at Buxar. There were the series of wars between the EIC and the Maratha Confederacy in central India. And there were the wars between the EIC and the state of Mysore in the southwest, led by Tipu Sultan, who you can learn more about over in our Nebula original. But even though these native forces put up stiff resistance, they were eventually overcome by the EIC's disciplined sepoy armies and their local allies, who were often deep in the EIC's pockets. Now, a lot of people who study this history are constantly frustrated by the lack of unity between Indian states threatened by the EIC. Why didn't they just work together to stop the British? I mean, they possessed equal technology and vastly greater numbers after all. But the problem with this type of analysis is that it projects modern notions of nationalism on the past. There was no such thing as a united Indian nation at this time. Heck, even Britain barely qualified as a modern nation in the 18th century, especially with the Scots and Irish constantly looking to overthrow English rule. Another barrier of Indian resistance involved the EIC's behavior. When thinking about imperial takeover, we usually get caught up in images conjured from science fiction, where an obviously evil foreign entity, wearing all black and accompanied by some super scary marching music, mercilessly destroys a resistance. But successful empires are more insidious than that, requiring acceptance and cooperation from the ruled. And the key to the EIC's success in India involved finding and keeping said collaborators. But how'd they do this? Well, turns out the exact same way the Mughal Empire had over the previous centuries. They practiced indirect rule. You find regional leaders who are willing to make a deal, and then you leave them in control of their own fiefdoms in exchange for a substantial cut of the revenues. And if your collaborator ever gets out of line, you simply eliminate them and find a new local leader interested in the top spot. The EIC attempted, as much as possible, to maintain the illusion that they were just another regional power in India, just like the Maratha Confederacy or Mysore. They even worked to prop up the Mughal emperor in Delhi, not because they were worried about his strength, but because they wanted to maintain the idea that nothing in India had really changed. As one historian put it, the EIC became Indian rulers. They won power through Indian political processes, and their rule depended on the yield of Indian taxation levied through Indian administrative systems. The British succeeded because they didn't act like a foreign conqueror. Or to put it another and more dramatic way, the greatest trick the devil ever played was convincing the world he didn't exist. But who were these devils in control of the EIC on the ground in India? Well, that takes us right back to our defendant at the top of the episode, Warren Hastings. Hastings came from a broken home and found in India the opportunities for power and fortune that would have eluded him back in Britain. Beginning in 1750, at the age of 17, Hastings quickly worked his way up the EIC's corporate ladder, thanks to his skills as a bureaucrat, an accountant, a linguist, and most importantly, a survivor, who managed to overcome the high British mortality rate in India due to disease. His skills and immune system allowed Hastings to become the de facto EIC governor of Bengal in 1772, a position he would hold until 1785. Then, Warren emphasized the principle of indirect rule. He attempted to mimic not only the methods of Mughal emperors, but also their culture. He elevated and befriended local leaders, and he personally managed diplomatic meetings in Urdu rather than using an interpreter. He also became a patron of local arts and culture. Unlike leaders in Britain, who were largely dismissive of Indian culture, Hastings believed that an appreciation of Indian civilization would be key to managing the empire. Though this policy of ruling like a Mughal didn't mean it was beneficial for everyone involved. Through these policies, Hastings and other company men in India, called nabobs, became fabulously wealthy as they funneled land revenues and kickbacks from local leaders into their own coffers. Meaning, it was not at all uncommon for an EIC employee to send home 3 times his yearly salary from private trading and gifts from Indian leaders. And this exorbitant transferal of wealth caused a significant financial drain on India because the nabobs rarely invested these personal fortunes, again accrued almost completely from Indian taxes, back into India itself. You know, it's kind of like if an American-based company that specialized in two-day shipping decided to invest its money in corporate space travel, not worker wages. But you know, what do I know? I'm just a cartoon on the internet. Simultaneously, like any good mafioso, the nabobs showed a complete disregard for common Indians in pursuit of power. They wanted their land values, or else. This to push ordinary cultivators to the breaking point, growing cash crops instead of food, a policy that led to a significant famine in 1770 that claimed the lives of an estimated 10 million people. This famine, along with the tales of corruption swirling around the EIC, led the British government to examine the company's work, and in particular, the poster boy for the nabob, Warren Hastings. And while Hastings himself was eventually acquitted on all charges, the damage to the company's profile caused by the impeachment trial itself was severe. So, under the East India Company Act of 1784, the operations of the EIC were brought under the direct supervision of the British government. The EIC remained nominally in charge, but the days of unfettered corruption had come to an end.
Okay, now with the evil EIC out of the picture, the common cultivator is saved, and they all lived happily ever after. Right?
Oh, Army, you sweet summer sofa. Not even close. Things are about to get much, much worse. But you know, that's next week's exclusion. Right now, in the spirit of my hoping it's a bonus day today, I want to talk about something that's been getting better. Watching all of my favorite educational creators over on Nebula. Nebula is our My Creators for Creators streaming service, featuring original content from some of our favorite educational entertainers on the internet, such as Joe Scott, Real Science, and Wendover Productions. Plus, it's home to not only a ton of our shows all ad-free, plus a few of our exclusive Nebula originals, but I'm also super psyched to announce that my erroneously titled podcast, The Podcast About Movies, is now on Nebula as well, where every week you can listen to me and my co-host Shahir Dowd investigate the conversation cinema can start and totally not yell at each other a bunch along the way. No. Seriously, it gets heated. It's pretty fun. And because CuriosityStream loves us independent educational creators, they've teamed up with us over at Nebula, so we can offer you a pretty amazing 2-for-1 deal. When you sign up for CuriosityStream using our link in the description, you'll get a matching Nebula subscription for free. Now, for the uninitiated, CuriosityStream is an online learning platform where you can watch thousands of amazing documentaries and award-winning original series. And since my brain has been mired in historical paradoxes these days, their documentary series, Royals Keeping the Crown, recently caught my eye, where they take a look into the rise and fall of British royalty in the 20th century through archived footage juiced with some super effective colorization techniques. So head on over to curiositystream.com/extra credits right now to get both phenomenal streaming services for only $14.97 for an entire year. Not only is that 26% off the regular price, but again, that's under $15 for an entire year, which still totally just blows my mind. And when you do, not only will you get to watch some of the best content the internet has to offer, but you'll also be helping out our channel in the process. And we're so thankful for your support. That's right, Zoe, Ahmed Ziad Turk, Alicia Bramble, Casey Mustia, Dominic Valenciana, Joseph Blaine, Kyle Murgatroyd, and O'Reels1 are fantastic legendary patrons. Kanpur, India, July 1857. We've been here before. Another small British garrison is under siege from a large Indian army. Seeing the hopelessness of their situation, the garrison surrenders, and the British leave their position on the promise of a safe withdrawal, though they leave behind some 200 women and children under the assumption that the attackers are only interested in forcing British troops to retreat. It's a familiar story up to this point, but the end of it shows how much things have changed on the subcontinent, because the siege of Kanpur occurred in the midst of a bloody escalation in the rebellion of 1857. Shortly after their surrender, the besiegers fire on the British garrison, nearly wiping it out. And several days later, the Indian army murders the women and children, throwing their bodies down a well. After decades of half measures, false starts, and paradoxes, the conquest of India is about to reach its hideously violent conclusion. Thanks so much to Bright Cellars for raising a glass to history and sponsoring this episode. Following the trial of Warren Hastings and the India Act of 1784, the EIC continued to run things on the ground in India, but increasingly the influence of the Nabob was being replaced by the British government itself. This shift in direction brought on a massive change in the style of the British Raj, or British rule, whereas Hastings had argued that the British should rule these people according to their own ideas, manners, and prejudices to avoid conflict. The new British administrators of the 19th century were more interested in making India as British as possible. This impulse to civilize India, as they put it, took hold in the 1820s, during a period called the Age of Reform. This reform, which lasted into the 1850s, included attempts to spread Christianity, promote English language, introduce the study of Western science and philosophy, and reshape the Indian court system with British law.
Hey, this is starting to sound like it's actual conquest.
Exactly, Army. These are the types of actions you expect a foreign imperial power to take, but they just confusingly occurred decades after Clive's victory at Plassey, like a virus that took over 6 years to activate. As the subcontinent entered the 1850s and the last vestiges of the Mughal system were scrubbed away, the resistance to the British Empire began to change as well. Whereas the EIC had presented itself as just another regional Indian power interested in wealth, the British government represented a threat to the very foundation of Indian life. A threat that would lead to a dramatic response in the near future. Meerut, India, May 10th, 1857. 85 Indian members of the Bengal Light Cavalry are sitting in jail. They've been placed there for refusing to use their weapons. These soldiers, made up of Muslims and Hindus, have heard a rumor. The British have been lubricating the cartridges of their Enfield rifles with pig fat, cow fat, or both. And these new cartridges require soldiers to bite off the greased ends before loading their weapons, thus forcing Muslims to ingest pork and Hindus to ingest beef. Now, in decades past, this situation may have led to a compromise solution between the EIC and their sepoys. I mean, duck fat, anyone? Come on. But in 1857, after years of living with Britain's civilizing mission, these greased cartridges represent the cherry on top of the Raj's culturally and racially insensitive London. Incensed by the treatment of their fellow soldiers and by decades of ignorant British rule, the remaining Indian members of the Bengal Light Cavalry rise up and break the 85 out of jail. They then pick up their Enfield rifles, loaded with their greased cartridges, and shoot their British officers before marching to Delhi. The rebellion that followed, often called the Sepoy Mutiny, was never really about the cartridges. It was about rejecting cultural imperialism and racial injustice. The war for India had begun. By the time the sepoys from Meerut reached Delhi, they were joined by thousands of peasants and local leaders who were just as upset about British civilization as the soldiers were. Then, after helping the sepoys capture Delhi, the rebels declared Bahadur Shah, the Mughal emperor who essentially lived under an EIC guard detail, to be their leader. Unfortunately for the rebels, most of India didn't join their resistance. Even as the rebellion caught fire in the north, there were few outbreaks of mutiny anywhere else. Plus, the rebels came from different walks of life, which meant there was little cohesion in their reasons for revolt. Peasants in their ranks wanted an end to the cycle of famine. Local leaders wanted a restoration of their old power and traditions, and the sepoys wanted the chance for better pay and respect. The British, on the other hand, possessed a clear objective: revenge. Just like with the Black Hole of Calcutta, the massacre at Kanpur galvanized British soldiers. Believing they were justified, the British gave in to their worst impulses. Soldiers competed with one another to execute mutinous prisoners of war and murdered them using barbaric means, including execution by cannon. British troops then took the bodies of rebels and hung them on roads and in bazaars across the subcontinent. Using loyal sepoys and these brutal tactics, the British brought an end to the hostilities in 1859. In the aftermath of the rebellion, the British government heaped blame on the East India Company, even though it was the government and not the EIC that directed the Age of Reform. The EIC was relieved of control of India and replaced in time by a new colonial bureaucracy based in London. In addition to the removal of the EIC, the British also did away with the farce of the Mughal Empire. They exiled Bahadur Shah and executed all of his potential successors. Interestingly, however, the new British Raj didn't do away with the symbols of the Mughal era. Indeed, in an effort to avoid the mistakes of the Age of Reform, the British actively attempted to bring back the look, feel, and pageantry of the Mughal Empire in an attempt to smooth over differences. And this culminated in 1877, when Queen Victoria was proclaimed Empress of India during the Raj's first Delhi Durbar. Now, the British crown already possessed India, but this proclamation and the Durbar were meant to show that Victoria was the rightful successor to the Mughal crown. It was a move that would have made Warren Hastings proud. But by the time of the first British Durbar, too much had changed. Because while the Durbar was designed to link the present with the past in a way that would appeal to Indians, turns out the most influential Indians at this time were now only interested in the future. And the Durbar in 1877 gave us a hint of that future. Thousands gathered for a massive coronation. But Victoria, the guest of honor, their new empress, just like Edward VII back in episode 1, didn't show up. Not only that, but the preparation for this spectacle drew support away from an ongoing famine that would cost the lives of some 4 million people. India was finally conquered. But despite the importance of this prize, it would always be held at arm's length and ruled with criminal neglect by the British. And nearly a century would pass before India could throw off the yoke of their absentee landlords. When we think about the end of empires, we usually think of a climactic event, like the sacking of a city or the assassination of an emperor. But with the conquest of the Mughal Empire, we get a very long, very drawn-out, confusing decline. And because the decline lasted decades, there were plenty of opportunities for things to turn out differently. In the 50 years between Aurangzeb's death and the Battle of Plassey, we could have seen the emergence of another great Mughal emperor. Heck, we could have seen the ultimate success of another European power on the subcontinent. And it wasn't until a full century and a half of British presence that they established a clear advantage, and even then, there were plenty more hiccups and problems to come, like the rebellion of 1857 before a full conquest. This is why this story defies easy retellings, but it's also why this story has such verve.
Oh man, the full story really bucks the old simple tale of European conquest, doesn't it? I mean, the British only won because they inadvertently became enshrined in the Mughal system of governance. A paradox indeed.
Oh, I'm proud of you, Army. Finally seeing the forest through the trees, huh? Now, of course, even if the Mughal Empire maintained its own power, they would have gotten some things wrong too. There still would have been diseases, famines, and wars to deal with. But those would have been India's mistakes to make and problems to solve. The fact is, people want to rule themselves, even when there's risks involved. And when things do go wrong, it helps the population to know that someone local is in charge, who shares their concerns and attitudes. But with the British Raj, India was too often left with an empty chair.
Hey!
Oh, sorry, no offense.
I know, I'm just playing.
Oh, Army, you've come a long way. Let's say we toast to the completion of this series with a nice glass of wine from our friends at Bright Cellars. Now, there are two things you should know about me when it comes to wine. One, I really enjoy having it on hand, especially with the upcoming influx of holiday guests. And two, I know absolutely nothing about selecting a good wine. Seriously, before Bright Cellars, I was just picking bottles based on the labels, and that got dicey quick. Bright Cellars is a monthly wine club that's made my process of wine selection an absolute breeze. Not only do they source their wines from small vineyards all over the world, but they also set up a super easy and fun 7-question quiz each month that gathers your taste preferences to deliver you wines you're guaranteed to love. For instance, when I took the quiz, they gave me a question about what chocolate I could eat for the rest of my life. But then I got to select the outside-the-box answer, where's the fruit candy? It's like these folks already know. Then in a few days, my custom curated box of wine showed up at my door. And while it was super cool to see what Bright Cellars selected for me, it was doubly so when they were right on the money. My favorite being the Ochevada Sauvignon Blanc, which really nailed that bright fruity acidity I was looking for. Whereas Jeff told me he and his wife really dug the Austrian Hertz and Heinz Zweig, a light-bodied red with notes of cherry cola, raspberry, and warm brown baking spices that pairs great with a pork schnitzel. Wait a minute, hold on, Jeff. Where'd you get all this wine knowledge? Ooh, that's right, the wine wisdom cards. For each bottle in your box, they send along a card that outlines the tasting notes, suggested pairings, best serving temperature, and origin. Basically, a neat little mini class filled with info so you can feel like a sommelier at your next dinner party or when you're writing ad reads. So assuming you're of the appropriate drinking age in your neck of the woods, how would you like to get all of that goodness delivered right to your door and a great deal to boot? Well, right now, you can get your first 6 bottles from Bright Cellars for 50% off by using our link in the description below. That's...
When you think of hot, you might think about the tragic time you ate too much wasabi. Or about getting into your car on a summer day when it feels more like stepping into a sauna. But heat can work in your favor, like during Verizon Red Hot Deal Days. Get hundreds of hot deals on all your favorites, like iPhone 16 Pro with Apple Intelligence, Apple Watch Series 10, and iPad, on any plan. Only until May 28th for new and existing customers. Offer available on My Plan, only at Verizon.
January 19th, 1922, University of Toronto. Day and night, for 11 days, James Collop has been in the lab, preparing sample after sample of a hormone taken from beef pancreas. His team hopes this will save thousands of children a year, but in truth, it's one specific child Collop is trying to save. And it's a race. Lying in bed at a Toronto General Hospital is 14-year-old Leonard Thompson. At the time of his admission 1 month before, he weighed only 65 pounds. Thompson has diabetes, a condition that, in 1921, offers children no future except a slow and painful death. The rest of the team, especially Dr. Banting, is breathing down Collop's neck. His last attempt at an extract had proved too impure, and Thomas had an allergic reaction. But now, this time, Collop thinks he's nailed it. When he tests the blood sugar of an injected rabbit, he finds it dropped. Finally a breakthrough. He's closing in on the mysterious hormone known as insulin. This episode is brought to you by the Child and Teen Checkups Program of Minnesota. Childhood obesity and diabetes are on the rise, but they're preventable, and children from birth to age 21 may even qualify for free checkups. Learn more at u21checkups.com. Diabetes mellitus is a condition that's so old, it was known even in ancient Egypt, but there was no treatment until the late 19th century. Even then, all doctors could offer were starvation diets, a regimen where a patient was allowed nothing but coffee with whiskey to dull the pain, and then gradually, food was added slowly until their urine showed an acceptable glucose or sugar level. Today, we know that diabetes is a long-lasting health condition that affects how the body turns food into energy. It causes high levels of glucose in the blood and can damage the kidneys, heart, and eyes. But by the turn of the century, doctors were only starting to understand that. Also at the time, they didn't know that there were two types of diabetes. Adults typically have type 2 diabetes, which can be caused by obesity. So in that case, losing weight did alleviate some of the symptoms. But children usually had type 1 diabetes, and for them, starvation diets were dangerous, since children need calories to build and grow their bodies and really have none to spare. And limiting their food intake could slow death from kidney damage, fluid in the lungs, and eventual coma. Most kids still only lived 6 months to a year in which they wasted away in diabetic wards, their parents mourning by their bedside before their children were even gone. But Dr. Frederick Banting thought he might be able to change all that. Banting was a farm boy born in Ontario, Canada. He was also a surgeon, having completed an accelerated medical degree in order to serve in an ambulance unit in World War I, where he was awarded the Military Cross. But he wasn't a researcher. So when he came to Dr. John James Rickard McLeod, the University of Toronto's foremost diabetes expert, and proposed an experiment, he got a chilly reception. Banting had read an article about how to keep the islets of Langerhans, which are groups of specialized cells in the pancreas, available for study without damaging them. And this was important because the islets had been suggested as the home of a substance called insulin, which was thought to have a role in diabetes. Now, just pause here for a moment. This next bit will discuss surgical experiments performed on animals that were, even then, considered cruel. So, if you'd prefer to skip these specific details, please jump ahead around 20 seconds. Banting laid out his plan. They would get a healthy dog and surgically tie off the islets of Langerhans, keeping them alive, but letting the rest of the pancreas die off. Then, they would let the insulin build up, create an extract from the islets, and inject it into another dog that had been artificially given diabetes by the removal of its pancreas, all while they would monitor its glucose. McLeod was unconvinced. It had been tried by better doctors than Banting, who in his eyes was little more than a military surgeon that had no research experience or even an advanced degree. In fact, it took him 3 meetings before Banting badgered McLeod into sponsoring the experiment. McLeod gave Banting the use of the laboratory and an undergraduate, Charles Best, as his assistant, and thus began one of the most trauma-prone research teams in history. And a lot of that was due to Banting and McLeod being fantastically mismatched. McLeod thought Banting was ill-prepared, with a shallow textbook knowledge of the pancreas. He felt the military surgeon kept botching the experiments. Meanwhile, Banting felt McLeod was undermining him by not giving him enough money for the project. Neither Banting or Best were paid, the lab space was dirty, and there was no money to hire an assistant to take care of the dogs. After several dogs died, Banting and Best were forced to start buying new experimentation dogs on the black market. But despite everything, they got results. And after showing they could use pancreas extract to help with diabetes in dogs, McLeod upped their funding. He also allowed Banting to bring in a 4th researcher, James Collop, to purify the extract. Plus, they made a further breakthrough when they found they could extract insulin from whole beef pancreas bought from slaughterhouses rather than the specially prepared dogs. Still, instead of publishing the results right away, McLeod made them run the dog experiments again and again. This made Banting furious, and he threatened. They quarreled again, and embarrassingly, despite his eagerness for a human trial, Banting wasn't even qualified to run the experiments on patients. But at last, the data convinced McLeod a human trial could begin. Though due to Banting's lack of qualifications, it was doctors at the hospital that were assigned to administer the insulin, not Banting. Toronto General Hospital, January 11th, 1922. Leonard Thompson is about to get the first ever dose of insulin. Banting is forced to wait in the hall with Best as the young doctor injects the insulin extract. The doctors tell them that there's no significant drop in glucose, which they test by checking Leonard's urine. And he also developed swelling at the injection site, the kind of dangerous side effect that stops a treatment dead. That's when Collop steps in. The team believes the extract is just not pure enough, and Collop is the key to solving that. So he works the problem day and night, developing a new process. And finally, on January 19th, all the late nights have paid off. He's managed to get pure insulin. But when Banting and Best ask Collop how he's done it, he refuses to tell them. See, while they've all agreed not to patent insulin, Collop argues that his purification method falls outside of that. Banting clenches his fists, and in an explosion of shouting, things get physical. Now, we don't know exactly what happened next, but Collop ended up on the floor, agreeing he would not profit off the discovery. And on January 23rd, Leonard Thompson gets his second purified injection of insulin. Within an hour, his blood sugar has dropped. He feels and looks instantly better. In a rush of excitement, they make more insulin, then take it to the diabetic ward where 6 children are lying in diabetic coma. And by the time they've injected the 6th child, they can hear the first child's parents weeping and yelling in happiness as their son awakes. A miracle. A miracle Banting, McLeod, Best, and Collop sell to a Canadian government laboratory for the grand sum of $1. They resolve not to profit on this discovery, though all will get personal accolades, with Banting becoming the most famous man in Canada. But that didn't stop their argument. In fact, fame and recognition would only turn up the heat further, because the story of insulin is not done. Because now that Banting, McLeod, Best, and Collop had discovered the miracle, they now had to find a way to mass produce it. And since these 4 men, racked with jealousy, paranoia, ambition, and mutual dislike, were about to enter an all-out battle over credit for the discovery, the drama was just getting started. Once again, thanks so much to Child and Teen Checkups Program of Minnesota for sponsoring this series. You know, thanks to insulin, diabetes is now a manageable condition. In fact, it was recently estimated that there are over 15 million diabetics alive today that would have died at an earlier age without it. But due to the obesity crisis, diabetes is also on the rise among children. So you should talk to your doctor at your next Child and Teen Checkups Well Child Check about your kids' diet and exercise, and how they can stay in a healthy weight range while also being physically fit and strong. Not to mention, Child and Teen Checkups also provides free mental health screening for those under 21. You can learn more and see if your child qualifies for free checkups over at u21checkups.com. That's the letter U, 21checkups.com. That's right, Zoe. Ahmed Ziadter, Alicia Bramble, Casey Busca, Dominic Valenciana, Joseph Lane, Kyle Murgatroyd, and O'Reills1 are fantastic legendary patrons. May 3rd, 1922, Washington, D.C. Dr. James McLeod stands before the annual meeting of the Association of American Physicians, presenting a news that makes fully public, for the first time, the results of their study. He describes how they've created a purified extract from beef or dog pancreas, and how in human trials, this extract has been used to treat diabetes. And for the first time, they give the extract a name, insulin. The paper he presents credits McLeod, Banting, Best, and Collop, as well as fellow researchers who worked on implementing insulin. And as the presentation ends, the audience gives McLeod a standing ovation, an action not seen at the meeting for 2 decades. But you know who isn't in attendance? Frederick Banting. See, he's back in Toronto, drinking himself to sleep and raging to anyone who will listen that McLeod is a grasping, unscrupulous, deceptive coward. Things are about to get interesting. This episode is brought to you by the Child and Teen Checkups Program of Minnesota. Childhood obesity and diabetes are on the rise, but they're preventable, and children from birth to age 21 may even qualify for free checkups. Learn more at u21checkups.com. Exactly why Banting or his assistant Best didn't attend the presentation remains unclear. We know that McCloud spoke at the meeting because he was the only member of the team who was actually a member of the association, but from there, details get hazy. Some stories say that McCloud refused to let the pair come due to expense, or that Banting and Best sat it out in protest for not getting enough credit for the discovery. Yep, that's right. Despite the success of their first clinical trial and the realization that they'd created a miracle drug together, Banting and McCloud were once again at each other's throats. When they'd succeeded in their first human trials, McCloud had brought more researchers onto the project to ensure the results were airtight before they announced them. Now, while that was probably necessary, he handled it badly, essentially demoting Banting and Best to extracting the insulin for the studies. And supposedly, he didn't even tell them the results of the experiments. Banting interpreted this as an attempt to minimize his role and hijack credit for the project, a project he'd had to drag McCloud into conducting. He entered a resentful depression, drinking heavily and not always bothering to show up for work. And a month before McCloud spoke at the event in DC, Banting contacted a journalist and provided quotes for an article telling the discovery from his point of view, emphasizing his and Best's role, helping to set the stage for a four-way scientific view of epic proportions. Which is unfortunate, because the discovery of insulin had been a team effort. It needed Banting for the idea and passion, McCloud for management and resources, Best for the experiments, and Collop to purify it. All of them had a necessary role, and the work wasn't done. Because while insulin worked, you can't have a medical treatment that needs to be painstakingly prepared by hand in a lab just before being administered. They discovered a miracle, that was true, but now they had to figure out how to produce and distribute that miracle at scale for patients that would need regular doses of it for the rest of their lives. Indeed, the reason McCloud had brought in more researchers in the first place was that this would be an even bigger challenge and require more specialists. And for a moment, it almost seemed like that effort would fail. Because as Banting scrambled for credit and McCloud presented in DC, Collop lost the knack for purifying insulin. See, to make bigger batches for the clinical trial, they've changed equipment. And something about these new devices just wasn't right. They could extract enough insulin for the study, but the purification process was failing. They couldn't even produce enough pure insulin to dose a single patient. After a frantic 2 months and many recriminations, they discovered the problem lay in the heating process that evaporated the alcohol. Then, after stabilizing the temperature issue, they were able to supply the clinical trial, but only barely. Even working with the Canadian government-owned Connaught Laboratories, they couldn't make enough. They needed a partner with vast production capacity. So when the Indianapolis-based pharmaceutical company Eli Lilly and Company offered to form a partnership, the team decided to share their manufacturing process. And the team-up worked, with Lilly scientists tackling some of the issues with creating larger batches. And that was a big challenge. At first, the potency varied from batch to batch, which could be dangerous, and the doses deteriorated quickly. Yet within months, Lilly had solved both of these problems to create a purer, more stable form of insulin. But the work with Lilly made getting a patent even more necessary. At first, the team hadn't wanted to patent the process for making insulin at all. But as Lilly looked more and more eager to patent parts of the process, it quickly became clear that if the Toronto team didn't file for a patent, others might do so and then produce doses with weaker quality control. So they revised their earlier plan, granting the patent to Connaught Labs for $1 and gave Lilly a non-exclusive license to produce their own version. Meanwhile, the wrangling over credit continued as McCloud and Collop moved on to other projects and Best finished his medical. Banting started a press era, putting himself at the center while minimizing McCloud and Collop's work. Now, McCloud mostly stayed above it at first, but when he heard the team was being considered for a Nobel Prize, he began publicly pushing back on what he called Banting's outbreaks. It got so bad that the university asked the two, plus Best, to write their own accounts of the discovery. They hoped to combine them and establish an official version, but that was abandoned when the results proved too cantankerous. But publicly, Banting's publicity campaign paid off. He was hailed as a genius scientist, got a reception with King George V, and was granted funding and a lifetime pension from the government, with the University of Toronto even adding a Banting and Best Chair of Medical Research. And then the Nobel Prize landed, jointly crediting Banting and McCloud. Can you guess who was furious? That's right, pal. Everyone. Everyone was furious. Banting was upset that they added McCloud but cut out Best, and McCloud was upset because Collop wasn't included. In fact, Banting even threatened to refuse the award. That is, of course, until a friend sat him down and asked if he was really going to deny Canada's first Nobel Prize winner. I mean, it would be huge for the university. Okay. Banting did accept the award, but shared his prize money with Bess, and McCloud, in turn, shared his with Colin. It didn't ultimately help. Though Banting and Colin became good friends, Colin was careful to stay out of the controversy. Banting refused to speak to McCloud for the rest of his life, and even soured on Best, who he thought was grasping for the chair named after them. Actually, in 1941, while serving as a wartime medical liaison to the UK, Banting boarded a dangerous transatlantic flight. And while talking about the possibility of a crash, he told a friend, "If they give my chair to that son of a Best, I'll roll over in my grave." And then that flight crashed, killing all but the pilot. And Best did indeed inherit that chair, as well as Banting's fight to get as much credit as possible. The remaining team all went on to make more discoveries or author prominent works, though none ever achieved the same heights as the discovery of insulin. Yet whoever deserved the credit, and just for the record we think they all did, the team's discovery left an incredible legacy. It gave children their lives. Leonard Thompson, on the verge of death when he received his first ever injection, lived to the age of 21 before dying of pneumonia. In 1962, Elizabeth Hughes, daughter of the U.S. Secretary of State, who at 14 years old weighed only 45 pounds, came to Toronto to privately receive her first course of insulin from Banting. She would have around 42,000 doses over her lifetime and lived to the age of 73. And insulin itself got better. By the 1960s, scientists were producing synthetic insulin rather than using animal extracts. And in 1978, researchers working with an Eli Lilly subsidiary produced the first synthetic human insulin by genetically engineering E. coli bacteria. Plus, delivery methods changed, from syringe to injection pens to ports and pumps. Though because these advances were not covered in the original patent, companies could more easily profit from them. In fact, the rising cost of insulin, which doubled in the United States between 2012 and 2016, mostly due to manufacturer, insurance, and pharmacy practices, is increasingly becoming a political issue. How much is a person expected to pay for life-saving medicine? Well, if it was up to Banting, Best, McCloud, and Cullen, as little as possible. And you know, maybe that should be their legacy. Because as much as they fought each other, they also fought for their discovery to be easily available so it could save as many people as possible. Once again, thanks so much to Child and Teen Checkups Program of Minnesota for sponsoring this series. You know, thanks to insulin, diabetes is now a manageable condition. In fact, it was recently estimated that there are over 15 million diabetics alive today that would have died at an earlier age without it.
80% of your data is unusable by AI. That's a lot of missed opportunity. Highland makes enterprise content and unstructured data agentic AI ready, secure, and actionable. Highland, turn insights into impact.
Bowling Green Plantation, Wilkinson County, Mississippi, 1795. Lala, a slave woman, hasn't seen her husband all day. Worried, she quietly looks for him until she hears a noise coming from a nearby barn. She finds her husband Jimmy dripping in sweat, hard at work on a large machine. He says their master wants another cotton gin, and that another machine will help make things easier for the other slaves. More cotton gins, he explains, meant white folks might even eventually free their slaves. At this, Lala admits she can't fathom how this was going to help free them. If more machines could process more cotton per day, wouldn't the white people just want more cotton picked? Jimmy dismisses his wife's concerns and rushes her out of the barn, and she goes to bed alone. But sleep doesn't come, because her gut tells her that her husband is wrong. This episode of Extra History is brought to you by all of our wonderful patrons over on Patreon. Thanks so much for your support. The cotton gin is a landmark in American technology, an invention that shows the promise of innovation and how that promise can go unfulfilled. A lesson that's quite relevant today. Because when it first appeared, some enslaved people thought the cotton gin would make their lives easier by removing the arduous task of removing cotton seeds by hand. Some even said that the device could pave the road to abolish slavery. And one person who reportedly believed that was the machine's inventor, Eli Whitney. Though ironically, his machine had the opposite effect. Born in Westborough, Massachusetts in 1765, Whitney exhibited talents for many things in his teens, including blacksmithing and manufacturing. In fact, he was talented in so many areas that he had a hard time figuring out what he wanted to do in life. So with his goals still scattered, he decided to attend Yale and parlay his degree into a teaching. Then, freshly graduated, he traveled to Georgia based on a job offer. But the promised employment fell through. Now alone, stranded, and unemployed, he had to make some new connections. But luckily for Whitney, a plantation owner by the name of Catherine Green took a shine to him, offering him housing and introducing him to her manager, Phineas Miller. They all became fast friends, and in 1793, the three of them played integral roles in the creation of a revolutionary machine, the cotton gin. Now some say Green actually came up with the design and Whitney just built it for her and operated as its frontman because, sexism. While others claim Green simply provided Whitney with funding and resources. But to understand why the cotton gin was such a game changer, you need to know a few things about cotton and how it was produced. You see, African Americans working on a cotton plantation were responsible for growing and picking cotton. Work, we should add, that they did in the oppressive heat while subjected to physical and verbal abuse from overseers. Then the plantation owners would sell the resulting crop to clothing and soft goods manufacturers. However, the cotton couldn't be sold or fashioned into anything until the ends and these fibers were removed. This was yet another thing accomplished through slave labor, and at the time, it could only be done by hand. Hands that were often left cracked and bloodied from the task by day's end. Even working from sunrise to sunset, with the overseer's whips cracking overhead, the average slave could only filter 1 pound of cotton a day. But drop that same pound of cotton into Whitney's machine, and the seeds would be removed in minutes. This launched the American cotton industry into the industrial age overnight. 2 slaves working a gin could now filter 50 pounds of cotton a day, and as use of the device became more widespread, an economic explosion took place. Because as production capacities grew, so did the demand. And just as the cotton gin arrived, advances in textile manufacturing meant factories in the UK needed more cotton. And guess where they got it from? As the southern cotton economy boomed, so did the institution of slavery. Actually, before Whitney's gin was introduced, many in the North thought slavery would eventually be phased out, as it had been proven to no longer be just an issue of morality, but also an unsustainable business model. Cotton, you see, had been about as profitable as tobacco and sugar, which is to say, not really at all, because turns out the cost of maintaining slaves was in fact greater than the profit from the crops they could produce. But Whitney's invention changed all that. Thanks to the cotton gin, the U.S. southern states would increase their output from 3,000 bales in 1790 to more than 3.8 million by 1860, accounting for nearly 3/4 of the world's cotton. And if you're thinking that at least with the machine the slaves might have had it easier, that wasn't the case. Because as slaves became more valuable to cotton plantations, tobacco farmers tried to recoup their losses by selling off their slaves to King Cotton, which in many cases meant irreversibly breaking up entire families. By contrast, plantation owners were keeping their families in even grander houses. Opulent mansions that, mind you, were also built with uncompensated slave labor. In fact, thanks to all their profits from slave labor, half of the millionaires in the United States lived in Natchez, Mississippi, with one man owning nearly 40,000 acres of land. That's 3 times the size of Manhattan. And despite the growing number of abolitionists pushing to end slavery, these so-called gentlemen were not going to give up their ill-gotten wealth without a fight. If anything, the existence of the cotton gin and its ability to satisfy the growing demand compelled them to double down. And not just on the human devastation, mind you, but on the environmental devastation as well. Mass cotton cultivation led to overharvesting, which irreparably damaged the once fertile soil. And when that soil began to show signs of faltering, the plantation owners decided to push the cotton industry and slavery further west. Meanwhile, as the cotton barons were getting even more wealthy, one person who didn't get rich was Eli Whitney. You see, while Whitney thought he would replace the failing institution of slavery with the cotton gin, this wasn't exactly out of the goodness of his heart. He was also in it for the money. But the money wouldn't come. Mostly because, while he and his team thought they were going to corner the market with the invention, their designs were ruthlessly pirated and duplicated. Imagine that. The same people who had no qualms about keeping human beings in bondage, stealing an invention. Now, of course, Whitney didn't take that lying down. In fact, he practically bankrupted himself filing lawsuits. And in the end, 3 states awarded him an accumulative reward of $90,000, a far cry from the millions King Cotton had earned. Disillusioned, Whitney returned to Connecticut, where in 1798, he parlayed his practical knowledge into a government contract to produce 10,000 muskets in 2 years. He'd complete the project in 10. Though, just an aside on that, though late in delivering the muskets, Whitney did pioneer the concept of interchangeable parts and standardization of mass production, which was a major development in American industrialization. He'd end up respected for that, if nothing else. Then in 1825, Whitney passed away from prostate cancer. Missing the tragedy his invention would inadvertently fuel, because as the southern states reaped massive wealth from cotton crops, many of the plantation owners also took high-ranking positions in local government. They fought tooth and nail to protect their cotton profits with legislation, and even managed to prevent Abraham Lincoln from appearing on the southern state ballots when he ran for president in 1860. And when Lincoln was still elected as the 16th president of the United States without a single southern vote, the plantation elite used their political influence to drag each state into secession from the Union, despite the fact that most of the white citizens were not members of the planter aristocracy that controlled their government. Unfortunately, Southerners were still drawn to support the secession and the impending Civil War, simply from the stance of not letting the North tell them what to do, or the promise that they too might one day own slaves. You know that old saying, the road to hell is paved with good intentions. Well, the story of the cotton gin kinda fits that adage to a T. True, there's no way of knowing how things would have played out had it not been invented, or even if it had taken another decade to come about. But the definitive lesson here is that progress for some often translates to a step back for others, especially in a free market scenario where profits and not justice are the priority. And as discussions over racial and economic disparity continue, it's easy to draw parallels between the cotton gin and our current era. How many times have we been sold a technology that's supposed to level the playing field or make everyone's lives easier? And how many times have we later learned that that same technology has terrible consequences for workers, consumers, or the environment? So the story of the cotton gin should remind us that technology itself can deliver justice and equality. That work is still up to all of us. You know, one of the main reasons we're able to make episodes of Extra History like the one you just watched is thanks to the generosity of all of our fantastic patrons over on Patreon. Now, if you'd like to join our Patreon community, not only will you be helping us create the content you love, but you'll also have cool options, like suggesting and voting on Extra History topics, viewing all of our shows early, accessing our lovely official Discord, snagging some exclusive 4K wallpapers and never-before-seen digital posters, and tons more. Just take a look at the tiers and see what tickles your fancy. But no matter if you want to help forge the future of Extra History, join an awesome community, or are just passionate about learning, please consider supporting our channel by clicking the card right up here. And if you do, you'll be joining the awesome ranks of Ahmed Ziad Turk, Alicia Bramble, Casey Muska, Dominic Valenciana, Joseph Blame, Kyle Murgatroyd, and O'Reels1, who are all fantastic legendary patrons. New Year's Day, 1903. It's the largest and most expensive coronation ceremony in modern history. The Delhi Durbar, the Mughal Empire's assembly, is reconvening to proclaim the ascension of a new emperor. Planning this took a full year. The ceremony's attended by nearly 200,000 people and kicks off 2 weeks of additional rituals and celebrations. And to accommodate the festivities, a humongous temporary tent city has been set up outside Delhi. It features electricity, telephone lines, sanitation, a hospital, a rail line, a courthouse, a police force, an art museum, a military parade ground, stores, dance halls, bandstands, polo grounds, and a post office that only uses commemorative Durbar stamps. Oh gee, no minute for getting it. As for the new emperor of India, he will be delivered to the ceremony on a golden house, a coffin elephant with candelabras attached to its tusks. So safe to say, everyone who was anyone in the empire would be at this event, except the emperor himself. Thanks so much to CuriosityStream for helping us share today's historical tale. Who did this new emperor think he was? I mean, what kind of person would duck out of a huge coronation, not to mention leave their extravagant MMO bounty? What if I told you the new emperor wasn't from the subcontinent at all? Heck, not even from Asia, but instead from a rainy island over 4,000 miles away. And what if I told you he was also from the but instead it doesn't make sense, does it? Well, consider this your first lesson in the complicated, tragic, and paradoxical history of the British conquest of India. Now this is an incredibly popular topic, but what really makes it interesting is the fact that it's popular not only with average people, but also professional historians. See, usually the professionals in this field thumb their noses at popular historical topics because they've been written about to death, so there's not much room for original research or writing. But with the conquest of India, things are different. Here's a topic that's so complicated and nuanced that it's impossible to develop an authoritative text about. Not to mention this event has something that all historians love, a historical paradox. An absurd or contradictory event that defies expectations. Now an armchair historian might say,
Well, how can we have a historical paradox when we already know how history unfolds?
events and things that led us to where we are now. But with a historical paradox, you have an outcome that doesn't match the events leading up to that point. Kinda like with an upset in sports. Okay, for a completely random and in no way pointed example, let's say your soccer team is up 3-0, going into the second half of the Champions League final in Istanbul. You'd expect to win, right? You'd be so confident, in fact, that you would be left in utter disbelief if in the end, your team lost. That's the kind of feel a historical paradox leaves you with. Sorry, Paul. And historical paradoxes draw people in, including professors, precisely because of their unfathomable nature. And with the conquest of India, we have brilliant historians who have dedicated their lives to understanding this one event and who often end up with incomplete answers. Nothing ever seems settled with the history of the conquest, and that helps to drive more interest and more interpretations. Given all this, we're not even going to pretend to offer you a definitive version of the conquest of India. The complex, decades-long process that affected billions of lives across multiple continents and 3 centuries, in hopes it inspires you to do more paradoxical digging of your own. So, let's start by talking about the historical paradox at the heart of the conquest, the idea that drives public interest and leads historians to dedicate their lives to this topic. How did the entire subcontinent of India become beholden to the rule of Britain, a comparatively tiny island off the coast of Europe, for nearly 2 centuries? How did a land of hundreds of millions of people come to be controlled by a preposterously small number of British administrators at a ratio of 1 colonial officer for every 250,000 Indians? And how did a technologically advanced, culturally influential, and militarily successful society end up throwing the party of the century for an idle foreign emperor who didn't even bother to show up?
How is this a paradox? Britain's conquest of India was inevitable. They had more money, better technology, more know-how, and nastier diseases.
Oh, I totally hear you, Army. That certainly is a common explanation for the conquest of India, and it's one you often see applied, rightly or wrongly, to histories of other European empires. But here, that explanation simply runs against the evidence, because when regular contact between Britain and India began at the start of the 17th century, their roles were very much reversed. India was the technologically advanced, wealthy, cosmopolitan empire with diseases known for killing Europeans, while Britain was the provincial, insignificant, comparatively impoverished backwater. Plus, in 1600, the English Empire only included Wales and parts of Ireland. In fact, the English state barely survived the 16th century and quite possibly would have been destroyed by the Spanish army, if not for a fortuitous storm. Not only were the English dwarfed at this time by imperial powers like Spain and France, but they'd often had trouble competing against even small European states like Portugal and the Dutch Republic. By the time the fabled East India Company established its first trade post in India in 1618, the Portuguese had been there for over a century, while the Dutch had established an impressive trade network based out of Indonesia. So when it came to empire building in the early modern era, the English were very much and also one of imperial powers. In contrast, India was ruled at the time by the Mughal Empire, led by the descendants of the great Mughal empires of the Middle Ages. Beginning with Emperor Babur in 1645, they established a near complete rule over the subcontinent by 1600. While the English were trying to keep the colonists from starving in Jamestown and going through a civil war at home, the Mughal Empire determined the lives of 180 million people, or roughly 20% of the world's population at the time. They maintained huge armies made up of hundreds of thousands of soldiers, with anything equivalent not being seen in Europe until the 19th century. Their soldiers were armed with the latest flintlock muskets, muzzle-loading cannons, and possessed some of the best cavalry in the world. Plus, and I cannot stress this enough, they had totally awesome armored elements. The Mughals also made use of a sophisticated administrative structure that drew power and wealth from land revenues. And through this structure, even petty nobles enjoyed a lifestyle many more times luxurious than the English monarch. And this is especially impressive when you realize that the Mughal emperors managed this system despite the fact that their kingdom was made up of an incredibly diverse collection of ethnicities, languages, and competing religious beliefs. By contrast, if you want to know how the European monarchs of the time dealt with religious differences, well, our 30 Years' War series can fill you in on that. So not only were the Mughals more successful than the Europeans, but their demographics meant they were playing on hard mode as well. True, the Mughals never tried to expand their empire overseas, but why leave home when you've already got all the good stuff? I mean, what drew Europeans to India in the first place wasn't a desire for conquest or to project strength, but rather a desperation for Indian commodities like pearls, gems, spices, silks, and manufactured cloth. The early European trading posts in India weren't signs of Mughal weakness, but signals of strength. We don't come to you, the Mughals basically declared. You come to us. European traders humbly petitioned Mughal emperors for permission to open fledgling trading ports along the coastline. But even successful European merchants had trouble finding any goods that Indians were willing to trade for, apart from gold and silver from the New World. And of all of these pitiful European traders begging the Mughals for access to their markets, the English at the time were unquestionably the most pathetic of the bunch. Far from being inevitable, from the perspective of the 17th century, the British conquest of India was more like outlandish speculative fiction, like Planet of the Apes outlandish. And yet, it happened. But as you'll find out next week, the how and the why of that process is just as perplexing as the premise. But you know what is a no-brainer? Spending less time watching ads like this one. Hi. Good thing I know a place where you can watch this series and all of our content ad-free. Of course, I'm talking about Nebula, our by creators for creators streaming service that's home to a ton of our favorite educational entertainers on the internet, such as Mariana's Corner, Well-Tone, and Real Engineering. Plus, you get to see exclusive Nebula originals, including some of ours, and extended cuts from fellow creators like Los Gamer, who absolutely knocked it out of the park with his video on the Game Boy Pocket's development. Man, what a wild ride it was getting that thing made just so I could play Castlevania on the go more easily. And because Curiosity Stream loves supporting independent creators, when you sign up for their service, you'll get access to Nebula absolutely free. And that's on top of Curiosity Stream's thousands of big-budget non-fiction videos and award-winning original series curated across their gigantic learning platform. And if our Conquest of India series has you interested in learning more, you might enjoy the show Planet of Treasures, India, which takes a super interesting look at its diverse and historic UNESCO World Heritage Site, and posits the question, what unites the subcontinent's diverse and gigantic 1.4 billion person population? So how can you get access to all these sweet shows and still have enough money to stock up for trick-or-treaters? Well, just head on over to curiositystream.com/extra credits to get a subscription to both Curiosity Stream and Nebula for 26% off the regular price. That's under $15 for both services for an entire year. Not only will you be elevating your content watching game to the next level, but you'll also be helping out us here at Extra Credits in the process. Thanks for That's right, Zoe. Ahmed Ziantur, Alicia Bramble, Casey Houston, Dominic Valenciana, Joseph Lane, Kyle Murgatroyd, and O'Reels1 are fantastic legendary patrons. Western Australia, November 2nd, 1932. For months, the soldiers-turned-wheat farmers of Campion and Wagulin have suffered the depredations of the terrible emu. After a vigorous mating season, the gangly, rambunctious birds had migrated west, dashing their massive bodies against wire fences until they fell, then trampling the precious crops under the ecstatic dance of their sharp claws. With conventional methods of bird deterrence failing, the farmers found themselves chasing down flocks of emus in their cars and on bicycles, waving sticks at the birds, who were so gleefully wiping out their livelihoods by spraying urine across hard-grown rows of wheat. But there were so many emu, and they were so fast, all seemed lost. That is, until a transport came over the horizon, carrying 3 soldiers from the 7th Heavy Battery of the Royal Australian Artillery and 2 mighty machine guns. Ah, yes! The farmers rejoiced. Perhaps they had lost the emu battle, but today was the dawn of the Emu War. Thanks so much to HelloFresh for continuing to help us bring history to the table. At 45 years old, Major Gwyneth Meredith had seen some action, but not often against birds. Compared to the violence of the Great War, he considered this campaign more like a zoo visit. And it's fairly easy, though not pretty, and, let's be honest, basically a dick move for a machine gun-toting soldier to shoot animals at a zoo. Meredith's plan was to herd the emus together for quick killing, because while his Lewis guns were powerful, they were cumbersome and not easily mobile. So with the farmer's help, he and his 2 soldiers attempted to shepherd a couple dozen emus into range of the guns. But the birds were not so easily corralled. Chased by Meredith, the flock split into smaller groups and fled, running away at 30 Calcutta, June 20th, 1756. It happened again. The EIC stepped over the line, and the local Indian ruler, in this case the Nawab of Bengal, has responded by capturing another British fort in another factory city. And just like the siege of Bombay, the Indians hope to make an example of the EIC. So the Nawab's men stripped the surviving British soldiers naked and Westminster Hall, February 13th, 1788. The House of Commons, the House of Lords, members of the royal family, foreign dignitaries, historians, and socialites are packed into the Palace of Westminster. But they aren't here for a monumental vote, or a declaration of war, or even a coronation. They're here for an impeachment trial. The defendant is Warren Hastings, who until recently was the East India Company's top man in Bengal. He stands accused of a litany of crimes, including embezzlement, extortion, dueling his political rivals, and the illegal killing of a Maharaja. And leading the prosecution against Hastings is the so-called father of modern conservatism, Edmund Burke. Hastings' alleged crimes were so numerous that it took him a full 2 days to introduce and explain each of the charges. And the trial itself eventually required 148 days of meetings over the course of 7 years. Sounds excessive, right? Well, consider this. What was at stake wasn't just Warren's reputation, but rather the past, present, and future of the British Empire in India. Thanks so much to CuriosityStream for helping us tell today's historical tale. Thanks to the Nawab, the East India Company had become the de facto rulers of Bengal. And this change was so sudden and unexpected that it represented a real-time paradox for the people of India and Britain. In India, they described the event using the Persian word inqilab, which translates roughly to topsy-turvy, or a surprising inversion of the existing order. As one Mughal poet put it, the revolution in Bengal left those who rode elephants as beggars in the streets, while it elevated the beggars into palaces. The British were equally caught off guard by these events. Most of Britain's attention in the 18th century had been focused on Europe and America, and now they turned around in 1765 to discover that the EIC, the company that was always on the verge of going bankrupt, now controlled a region with a higher population and landmass than Britain itself. And it's important to remember how the company gained this power. On its surface, the EIC was a trading company, but in reality, it had become a private security firm that operated a bit like the mafia. They built up their paid sepoy armies, sold protection to the highest local bidder, and when those customers couldn't pay, the EIC demanded, and usually got, taxation rights. Why, good sir, what a fine and majestic subcontinental region you have here. 'Twould be a pity if something were to happen to it. Afterwards, the EIC could use said taxes to build up their military power and force their way into new territories, thus increasing their profits. And in the words of one EIC officer, the EIC eventually destroys every government that it seeks to protect. How's that for a paradox, huh?
Okay, so this is a paradox, I get that. But if it was an absurdity at the time, why didn't anyone do anything about it?
Oh, a lot of people tried, especially in India. As you know, there were the combined attempts by the Nawab of Bengal and the Mughal emperor that ended at Buxar. There was a series of wars between the EIC and the Maratha Confederacy in central India, and there were the wars between the EIC and the state of Mysore in the southwest, led by Tipu Sultan, who you can learn more about over in our Nebula original. But even though these native forces put up stiff resistance, they were eventually overcome by the EIC's disciplined sepoy armies and their local allies, who were often deep in the EIC's pockets. Now, a lot of people who study this history are constantly frustrated by the lack of unity between Indian states threatened by the EIC. Why didn't they just work together to stop the British? I mean, they possessed equal technology and vastly greater numbers after all. But the problem with this type of analysis is that it projects modern notions of nationalism on the past. There was no such thing as a united Indian nation at this time. Heck, even Britain barely qualified as a modern nation in the 18th century, especially with the Scots and Irish constantly looking to overthrow English rule. Another barrier of Indian resistance involved the EIC's behavior. When thinking about imperial takeover, we usually get caught up in images conjured from science fiction, where an obviously evil foreign entity, wearing all black and accompanied by some super scary marching music, mercilessly destroys a resistance. But successful empires are more insidious than that, requiring acceptance and cooperation from the ruler. And the key to the EIC's success in India involved finding and keeping said collaborators. But how'd they do this? Well, turns out, the exact same way the Mughal Empire had over the previous centuries. They practiced indirect rule. You find regional leaders who are willing to make a deal, and then you leave them in control of their own fiefdoms in exchange for a substantial cut of the revenues. And if your collaborator ever gets out of line, you simply eliminate them and find a new local leader interested in the top spot. The EIC attempted, as much as possible, to maintain the illusion that they were just another regional power in India, just like the Maratha Confederacy or Mysore. They even worked to prop up the Mughal emperor in Delhi, not because they were worried about his strength, but because they wanted to maintain the idea that nothing in India had really changed. As one historian put it, the EIC became Indian rulers. They won power through Indian political processes, and their rule depended on the yield of Indian taxation levied through Indian administrative systems. The British succeeded because they didn't act like a foreign conqueror. Or to put it another and more dramatic way, the greatest trick the devil ever played was convincing the world he didn't exist. But who were these devils in control of the EIC on the ground in India? Well, that takes us right back to our defendant at the top of the episode, Warren Hastings. Hastings came from a broken home and found in India the opportunities for power and fortune that would have eluded him back in Britain. Beginning in 1750, at the age of 17, Hastings quickly worked his way up the EIC's corporate ladder, thanks to his skills as a bureaucrat, an accountant, a linguist, and most importantly, a survivor who managed to overcome the high British mortality rate in India due to disease. His skills and immune system allowed Hastings to become the de facto EIC governor of Bengal in 1772, a position he would hold until 1785. There, Warren emphasized the principle of indirect rule. He attempted to mimic not only the methods of Mughal emperors, but also their culture. He elevated and befriended local leaders, and he personally managed diplomatic meetings in Urdu rather than using an interpreter. He also became a patron of local arts and culture. Unlike leaders in Britain, who were largely dismissive of Indian culture, Hastings believed that an appreciation of Indian civilization would be key to managing the empire. Though this policy of ruling like a Mughal didn't mean it was beneficial for everyone involved. Through these policies, Hastings and other company men in India, called nabobs, became fabulously wealthy as they funneled land revenues and kickbacks from local leaders into their own coffers. Meaning, it was not at all uncommon for an EIC employee to send home 3 times his yearly salary from private trading and gifts from Indian leaders. And this exorbitant transfer of wealth caused a significant financial drain on them. Because the nabobs rarely invested these personal fortunes, again accrued almost completely from Indian taxes, back into India itself. You know, it's kind of like if an American-based company that specialized in food and shipping decided to invest its money in corporate space travel rather than worker wages. But you know, what do I know? I'm just a cartoon on the internet. Simultaneously, like any good mafioso, the nabobs showed a complete disregard for common Indians in pursuit of profit. They wanted their land revenues, or else. This caused local Indian collaborators to push ordinary cultivators to the breaking point, growing cash crops instead of food, a policy that led to a significant famine in 1770 that claimed the lives of an estimated 10 million people. This famine, along with the tales of corruption swirling around the EIC, led the British government to examine the company's work, and in particular, the poster boy for the nabob era, Warren Hastings. And while Hastings himself was eventually acquitted on all charges, the damage to the company's profile caused by the impeachment trial itself was severe. So, under the East India Company Act of 1784, the operations of the EIC were brought under the direct supervision of the British government. The EIC remained nominally in charge, but the days of unfettered corruption had come to an end.
Okay, now with the evil EIC out of the picture, the common cultivator is saved and they all lived happily ever after. Right?
Oh, Army, you sweet summer sofa. Not even close. Things are about to get much, much worse. But you know, that's next week's doom and gloom. And right now, in the spirit of my hoping it's a... Kanpur, India, July 1857. We've been here before. Another small British garrison is under siege from a large Indian army. Seeing the hopelessness of their situation, the garrison surrenders, and the British leave their position on the promise of a safe withdrawal, though they leave behind some 200 women and children under the assumption that the attackers are only interested in forcing British troops to retreat. It's a familiar story up to this point, but the end of it shows how much they... January 19th, 1922, University of Toronto. Day and night, for 11 days, James Collop has been in the lab, preparing sample after sample of a hormone taken from pea pancreas. His team hopes this will save thousands of children a year, but in truth, it's one specific child Collop is trying to save. And it's a race. Lying dead at Toronto General Hospital is 14-year-old Leonard Thompson. At the time of his admission 1 month before, he weighed only 65 pounds. Thompson has diabetes, a condition that in 1921 offers children no future except a slow and painful death. The rest of the was spent with Dr. Bantam and treating Thompson's neck. His last attempt at an extra had moved to the shore and Thompson had an allergic reaction. But this time, Collop thinks he's nailed it. When he tests the blood sugar of an injected rabbit, he finds it dropped. Finally a breakthrough. He's closing in on the mysterious hormone known as insulin. This episode is brought to you by the Child and Teen Checkups Program of Minnesota. Childhood obesity and diabetes are on the rise, but they're preventable, and children from birth to age 21 may even qualify for free checkups. Learn more at u21checkups.com. Diabetes mellitus is a condition that's so old, it was known even in ancient Egypt, but there was no treatment until the late 19th century. Even then, all doctors could offer were starvation diets, a regimen where a patient was allowed nothing but coffee with whiskey to dull the pain, and then gradually food was added slowly until their urine showed an acceptable glucose or sugar level. Today, we know that diabetes is a long-lasting health condition that affects how the body turns food into energy. It causes high levels of glucose in the blood and can damage the kidneys, heart, and eyes. But by the turn of the century, doctors were only starting to understand that. Also at the time, they didn't know that there were two types of diabetes. Adults typically have type 2 diabetes, which can be caused by obesity. So in that case, losing weight did alleviate some of the symptoms. But children usually had type 1 diabetes, and for them, starvation diets were dangerous, since children need calories to build and grow their bodies, and really have none to spare. And while limiting their food intake could slow death from kidney damage, fluid in the lungs, and eventual coma, most kids still only lived 6 months to a year in which they wasted away in diabetic wards, their parents mourning by their bedside before their children were even gone. But Dr. Frederick Banting thought he might be able to change all that. Banting was a farm boy born in Ontario, Canada. He was also a surgeon, having completed an accelerated medical degree in order to serve in an ambulance unit in World War I, where he was awarded the Military Cross. But he wasn't a researcher. So when he came to Dr. John James Rickard MacLeod, the University of Toronto's foremost diabetes expert, and proposed an experiment, he got a chilly reception. Banting had read an article about how to keep the islets of Langerhans, which are groups of specialized cells in the pancreas, available for study without damaging them. And this was important because the islets had been suggested as the home of a substance called insulin, which was thought to have a role in diabetes. Now, just pausing here for a moment. This next bit will discuss surgical experiments performed on animals that were, even then, considered cruel. May 3rd, 1922, Washington, D.C. Dr. James MacLeod stands before the annual meeting of the Association of American Physicians, presenting a paper that makes fully public for the first time the results of their study. He describes how they created a purified extract from beef or dog pancreas, and how in human trials, this extract has been proven to treat diabetes. And for the first time, they give the extract a name, insulin. The paper he presents credits MacLeod, Banting, Banting, and Collop, as well as fellow researchers who worked on implementing insulin in medicine. And as the presentation ends, The audience gives McCloud a standing ovation, an action not seen at the meeting for 2 decades. But you know who isn't in attendance? Frederick Banting. See, he's back in Toronto, drinking himself to sleep and raging to anyone who will listen that McCloud is a grasping, unscrupulous, deceptive coward. Things are about to get interesting. This episode is brought to you by the Child and Teen Checkouts program of Minnesota.
Start your summer off right this Memorial Day weekend with free treats for the whole fam at all available with flexible financing to fit your budget and fast, friendly delivery. Oh my Bob! So come down or visit mybobs.com and save big this Memorial Day weekend.
Childhood obesity and diabetes are on the rise, but they're preventable. And children from birth to age 21 may even qualify for free checkups. Learn more at u21checkups.com. Exactly why Banting or his assistant Best didn't attend the presentation remains unclear. We know that McCloud spoke at the meeting because he was the only member of the team who was actually a member of the association, but from there, details get hazy. Some stories say that McCloud refused to let the pair come due to expense, or that Banting and Best sat it out in protest for not getting enough credit for the discovery. Yep, that's right. Despite the success of their first trial and the realization that they created a miracle for each other, Banting and McCloud were going in at equal pace. When they succeeded in their first trial, McCloud had done more research to ensure the results were airtight before they announced it. An outline of his knowledge was essentially he entered a resentful depression, drinking heavily and not always bothering to show up for work. And a month before McCloud spoke at the event in DC, Banting contacted a journalist and provided quotes for an article telling the discovery from his point of view, emphasizing his and Best's role, helping to set the stage for a 4-way scientific feud of epic proportions. Which is unfortunate, because the discovery of insulin had been a team effort. It needed Banting for the idea and passion, McCloud for management and resources, Best for the experiments, and Colin for purifying. All of them had a necessary role, and the work wasn't easy. Because while insulin works, you can't have a medical treatment that needs to be painstakingly prepared by hand in a lab just before being administered. They discovered a miracle, that was true, but now they had to figure out how to produce and distribute that miracle at scale for patients that would need regular doses of it for the rest of their lives. Indeed, the reason McCloud had brought in more researchers in the first place was that this would be an even bigger challenge and require more specialists. And for a moment, it almost seemed like that effort would fail. Because as Banting scrambled for credit and McCloud presented in DC, Collip lost the knack for purifying insulin. See, to make bigger batches for the clinical trial, they'd changed equipment. And something about these new devices just wasn't right. They could extract enough insulin for the study, but the purification process was failing. They couldn't even produce enough pure insulin to dose a single patient. After a frenzy and patients, they discovered the process could evaporate the output. Then after stabilizing they were able to try, but overall, even working with the Canadian government collaboratively, they couldn't they needed partnerships fast without being fast. So when the Indianapolis-based pharmaceutical company Eli Lilly offered to form partnerships, the team decided to share the manufacturing process. And with Lilly's partner, actually some of the issues and that was a big challenge. And the sharing was bad. began publicly pushing back on what he called Banting's outbreaks. It got so bad that the university asked the two, plus Best, to write their own accounts of the discovery. They hoped to combine them and establish an official version, but that was abandoned with the result. But Banting he was hailed as a genius scientist, daughter of the second King George V, and was granted funding and a lifetime pension from the government, with the University of Toronto even adding a Banting Investment Chair of Medicine. And then the Nobel Prize winner jointly credited Banting and the lab. That's right, pal. Everything was curious. Banting was obsessed with the anime cloud because Best, and McCloud was obsessed because Cullen was. In fact, that is, of course, when his friend sat him down and asked if he was really going to deny his first Nobel Prize. I mean, he would be a but shared his prize with Best, and McCloud in turn shared his Cullen was careful to stay out of public. Banting refused to speak to McCloud for the rest of his life, and even soured on Best, who he thought was grasping for the chair named after them. Actually, in 1941, while serving as a wartime medical liaison to the UN, Banting boarded a dangerous transatlantic flight, and while talking about the possibility of a crash, he told a friend, "If they give my chair to that son of a Best, I'll roll over in my grave." And then, that flight crashed, killing all but the pilot. And Best did indeed inherit that chair, as well as Banting's fight to get as much credit as possible. The remaining team all went on to make more discoveries or author prominent works, though none ever achieved the same heights as the discovery of insulin. Yet whoever deserved the credit, and just for the record, we think they all did, the team's discovery left an incredible legacy. It gave children their lives. Leonard Thompson, on the verge of death when he received his first ever injection, lived to the age of 21 before dying of pneumonia. In 1922, Elizabeth Hughes, daughter of the U.S. Secretary of State, who at 14 years old weighed only 45 pounds, came to Toronto to privately receive her first course of insulin from Banting. She would have around 42,000 doses over her lifetime and live to the age of 73. And insulin itself got better. By the 1960s, scientists were producing synthetic insulin rather than using animal extracts. And in 1978, researchers working with an Eli Lilly subsidiary produced the first synthetic human insulin by genetically engineering E. coli bacteria. Plus, delivery methods changed, from syringe to injection pens to ports and pumps. Though because these advances were not covered in the original patent, companies could more easily profit from them. In fact, the rising cost of insulin, which doubled in the United States between 2012 and 2016, mostly due to manufacturer, insurance, and pharmacy practices, is increasingly becoming a political issue. How much is a person expected to pay for life-saving medicine? Well, if it was up to Banting, Best, McCloud, and Cullen, as little as possible. And you know, maybe that should be their legacy. Because as much as they fought each other, they also fought for their discovery to be easily available, so it could save as many as possible. Once again, thanks so much to Child and Teen Checkup Program of Minnesota for sponsoring this series. You know, thanks to insulin, diabetes is now a manageable condition. In fact, it was recently estimated that there are over 15 million diabetics alive today that would have died at an earlier age without it. But due to the obesity crisis, diabetes is also on the rise among children. So you should talk to your doctor at your next Child and Teen Checkup's Well Child Check about your kids' diet and exercise, and how they can stay in a healthy weight range, while also being physically fit and strong. Not to mention, Child and Teen Checkups also provides free mental health screenings for those under 21. You can learn more and see if your child qualifies for free checkups over at u21checkups.com. That's the letter U, 21checkups.com. That's right, Zoe, Ahmed, Turk, Alicia Bramble, Casey Mustia, Dominic Valenciana, Joseph Blaine, Kyle Murgatroyd, and O'Reels1 are fantastic legendary patrons. Calcutta, June 20th, 1756. It happened again. The EIC stepped over the line, and the local Indian Westminster Hall. February 13, 1788. The House of Commons, the House of Lords, members of the royal family, foreign dignitaries, historians, and socialists are packed into the Palace of Westminster. But they are here for a monumental vote, for a war, or even a coronation. They're here. The defendant was the East India Company's top man in Bengal. He stands accused of a litany of crimes, including embezzlement, extortion, dueling his political rivals, and the illegal killing of a Maharaja. And leading the prosecution against Hastings is the so-called father of modern conservatism, Edmund Burke. Hastings' alleged crimes were so numerous that it took 42 days to introduce and explain each of the charges, and the trial itself eventually required 148 days of meetings over the course of 7 years. Sounds excessive, right? Well, consider this. What was at stake wasn't just Warren's reputation, but rather the past, present, and future of the British Empire. Thanks so much to Curiosity Stream for helping us tell today's historical tale. Thanks to the Dewan, the East India Company had become the de facto rulers of Bengal, and this change was so sudden and unexpected that it represented a real-time paradox for the people of India and Britain. In India, they described the event using the Persian word inqilab, which translates roughly to topsy-turvy or a surprising inversion of the existing order. As one Mughal poet put it, the revolution in Bengal left those who rode elephants as beggars in the streets, while it elevated the beggars into palaces. The British were equally caught off guard by these events. Most of Britain's attention in the 18th century had been focused on Europe and America, and now they turned around in 1765 to discover that the EIC, the company that was always on the verge of going bankrupt, now controlled a region with a higher population and landmass than Britain itself. And it's important to remember how the company gained this power. On the surface, the EIC was a trading company, but in reality, it had become a private security firm that operated a bit like the mafia. They paid sepoy armies, sold protection to the highest local bidder, and when those customers couldn't pay, the EIC demanded, and usually got, taxation rights. Why, good sir, what a fine and majestic subcontinental region you have here. 'Twould be a pity if something were to happen to it. Afterward, the EIC could use said taxes to build up their military power more and force their way into new territories, thus increasing their profits. And in the words of one EIC officer, the EIC eventually destroys every government that it seeks to protect. How's that for a paradox, huh?
Okay, so this is a paradox, I get that. But if it was an absurdity at the time, why didn't anyone do anything about it?
Oh, a lot of people. Kanpur, January 19th, 1922, University of Toronto. Day and night, for 11 days, James Collop has been in the lab, preparing sample after sample of a hormone taken from beef pancreas. His team hopes this will save thousands of children a year, but in truth, it's one specific child Collop is trying to save. And it's a race. Lying in bed at a Toronto General Hospital is 14-year-old Leonard Thompson. At the time of his admission 1 month before, he weighed only 65 pounds. Thompson has diabetes, a condition that in 1921 offers children no future except a slow and painful death. The rest of the team, especially Dr. Banting, is breathing down Collop's neck. His last attempt at an extract had proved too impure, and Thomas had an allergic reaction. But now, Collop thinks he's nailed it. When he tests the blood sugar of an injected rabbit, he finds it dropped. Finally a breakthrough. He's closing in on the mysterious hormone known as insulin. This episode is brought to you by the Child and Teen Checkups Program of Minnesota. Childhood obesity and diabetes are on the rise, but they're preventable, and children from birth to age 21 may even qualify for free checkups. Learn more at u21checkups.com. Diabetes mellitus is a condition that's so old, it was known even in ancient Egypt. But there was no known treatment until the late 19th century. Even then, all doctors could offer were starvation diets, a regimen where a patient was allowed nothing but coffee with whiskey to dull the pain, and then gradually, food was added slowly until their urine showed an acceptable glucose or sugar level. Today, we know that diabetes is a long-lasting health condition that affects how the body turns food into energy. It causes high levels of glucose in the blood and can damage the kidneys, heart, and eyes. But by the turn of the century, doctors were only starting to understand that. Also at the time, they didn't know that there were two types of diabetes. Adults typically have type 2 diabetes, which can be caused by obesity. So in that case, losing weight did alleviate some of the symptoms. But children usually had type 1 diabetes, and for them, starvation diets were dangerous, since children need calories to build and grow their bodies and really have none to spare. And while limiting their food intake could slow death from kidney damage, fluid in the lungs, and eventually coma, most kids still only lived 6 months to a year in which they wasted away in diabetic wards, their parents mourning by their bedside before their children were even gone. But Dr. Frederick Banting thought he might be able to change all that. Banting was a farm boy born in Ontario, Canada. He was also a surgeon, having completed an accelerated medical degree in order to serve in an ambulance unit in World War I, where he was awarded the Military Cross. But he wasn't a researcher. So when he came to Dr. John James Rickard MacLeod, the University of Toronto's foremost diabetes expert, and proposed an experiment, he got a chilly reception. Banting had read an article about how to keep the islets of Langerhans, which are groups of specialized cells in the pancreas, available for study without damaging them. And this was important because the islets had been suggested as the home of a substance called insulin, which was thought to have a role in diabetes. Now, just pausing here for a moment. This next bit will discuss surgical experiments performed on animals that were even then considered cruel. So, if you prefer to skip these specific details, please jump ahead around 20. May 3rd, 1922. Washington, D.C. Dr. James MacLeod stands before Bowling, Delhi, India.
Mommy from a voice. You haven't even seen her. It's a voice. Oh, check. Because she came home from college or whatever it was. She ain't, she ain't, you know what I mean? Okay. I can't leave yet. I need to gather the wait, I just picked up on Who said triple XL apartment? Well, I like this hallway. It's real spacious. Nice little spacious hallway. Okay, this is a very out of order. I should probably go back upstairs and figure something out. I think I heard something coming from that closet. Do we open the closet? So bad he passed away on live. You can see it now.
Girl, you scared the bejesus out of me.
My bad, hold on.
I did it! Let's go!
Unlock your full potential by following your passion at Orange Coast College. Whether you dream of pursuing a career in technology, culinary arts, business, or beyond, OCC will support your journey every step of the way. With over 130 programs, exceptional faculty, and state-of-the-art facilities, OCC provides the perfect environment to explore your interests and turn your passion into reality. Apply now at orangecoastcollege.edu. Fall classes begin August 25th.
I scared you? You scared me.
Yo, DVD fan with 550. Yo, Queen with $200. Yo.
Let's go. Let's go.
Yo, Case, just want to say how much I love watching your stream, constantly laughing throughout the night because of you. Love you, man. But seriously, you're built like. Absolutely insane. I Yeah, I am built like him. You know what? You're modded. Yo, Badger with 5 gifted. Yo, Badger, I appreciate that. $40 from High Five goes. Love the streams. You're always giving me a good laugh. Yo, High Five, I appreciate the 40 though. Thank you. Yo, I really do appreciate that $200. That means a lot, seriously.
What are you doing creeping around down here?
What are you doing, Joe?
Look, I'm sorry for scaring you. I'll tell you, but can you keep this to yourself?
Yo, Cable, I appreciate the 5 gifted. Thank you, Cable.
Jesus Christ, Joe, you're insane. Yeah, I can. What's up?
The missus kicked me out and it's too cold outside, so I'm trying to wait her out down here. I really didn't mean to creep on you. Honest.
Chat, you think you was creeping on me?
I believe you. Just next time, maybe don't go around slinging.
Why are y'all saying mommy? It's a voice! It's a voice! Oh, y'all are down horrendously bad. Like you are down horrendously bad. Horrendous!
Doors open and hiding in the dark.
I will. Thanks, kid. Say, if you want to use the washing machine, it's broken.
Yeah, thanks. I figured that out.
Have a good one, Joe.
Nom nom nom.
world these days. Liam been treating you well?
Chat, does that sound like somebody?
Is in the trunk. Yeah.
Look, you'll tell me if it gets bad. Yeah?
Does that sound like Lee from The Walking Dead?
I know it ain't easy to talk about. And you don't have to tell me nothing. Just promise me you'll tell me if you need help. My sister used to be in a bad situation too. And there's places you can go.
R.I.P. I still have
I appreciate that, Stan. I really do.
Yeah, sure. You doing some laundry at this time of night?
Spoilers? Buddy, I literally played it online like 3 months ago. What are you talking about spoilers? We played it online like 3-4 months ago.
I'm trying to. Of course, when I really need it, the water downstairs.
Laundromat is open 24/7, just outside of town. Still early enough for this last bus. I'll have to say, it's time to be out, especially with that maniac
I'm a big girl, Stan. Do you know the address?
Sure. Let me know. Just promise me you'll take care of it.
Collections now at Ashley. Featuring precision-fit coils arranged right where you need them for targeted support, night after night. Sealy at Ashley. Wake up to what's next.
I feel like mom code requires me to share this. But most favorite, but also and we are snapping. One of my friends actually introduced me to the band for the lawn makers, so I gotta share with you. With 9 years of baking into the sugar living circles, and my go-to wherever we are headed. So good and so easy.
Is this my purse? Oh, got it. Yo, for real, much love, guys. Thank you, and I do appreciate it. Oh.
Centric.
Okay.
Go on.
Okay, I'm gonna walk by you like I don't see you.
Yeah.
Centric going up. isn't getting any lighter. Sentry down!
Chad, do I gotta go into the car? Spencer, don't.
Dispenser down!
Sentry going up!
Go on, get! Sentry down!
Dispenser going up.
That was getting heavy. Dispenser down! Go on, get! Sentry down!
Chad, why is he standing there?
Did anyone die in that round?
I checked him, I checked him.
Did it!
Good job, Mommy. Let's go.
Sir, can you sit down? Sir, I don't... Sir, I don't like how you're sitting there. You're standing there. Sir.
Nature's so delicious, my face should be on the bag. Fine, sis. Teamwork. Nature's path.
You've always loved making things. You could say, handmade is in your DNA.
Hello, guest.
So,
My name is Guest.
when it comes time to share some exciting news,
Get away from me!
Hello. May I sit beside you?
You don't see all them other seats?
There's plenty of other seats, so I don't see why you would need to do that.
Facts! Facts! Yo, Jake, for $5.50, thank you, Jake!
May I sit beside you?
Buddy, I just said no, you can't sit beside me. There's a million other seats.
You deaf?
Tell him, Sarah. Yo, DVD with another DVD, I appreciate you.
Do I need to get the driver to throw you off?
Yeah, buddy, I'll get the driver to throw you off. You understand me? You need to get up out of my face. Your breath hot.
You're going to die tonight.
You can sit beside me. Yeah, you can sit right over here beside me. I'm sorry.
What?
Yeah, right there. Wide open seat. You can just chill right there till I get to the, what's it called? I'm sorry, I didn't mean what I said.
You're going to die tonight.
Sir.
I've seen it. Tonight is your last night on Earth.
Sir, I really was joking. I was really joking about not letting you sit beside me. I promise you I was joking. You can sit beside
You
me.
are walking straight into your doom. Can't you see that? You and that child inside you.
How do you know I'm pregnant, sir?
How did you?
You will be found just like all the others. Your inside display for all the angels to look down and see. Oh yes, of that I am certain.
Chat, we should just say yes.
Please, just stop talking.
May I sit beside you?
All right, miss. This is your stop.
May I sit beside you?
Yo, Shrek, why are you looking at me like that, buddy? This is a nice little hotel you got there. Hold on, let me turn the sensitivity down a little bit. Hey, Shrek.
Oh, hello there. Welcome to Shrek's Hotel. How can I help you?
I'm just trying to stay a couple nights. Chat, there's no prediction for this game!
Hi, can I get room for 5 nights, please?
Oh, 5 nights, yeah. Can I get 5 nights, please?
Sure, we have an empty room on the 2nd floor.
2nd floor, okay. Which room?
Ain't no way that hit me, boy.
Hey, yo. Hey. What? I'm kidding. Yo, did you... Yo. We've already played this. This is the second. This nerd sees 2 seconds of the screen and completely ignores the past 2 minutes. Like I keep just saying, this is second. This is the second we've never played. Yo, my gas getting low, my car is running on. I have a beard is so I protect from cutting people because my jawline's so sharp. Yo, Shrek, can I use the... Yo, why you looking at me? Hey, Shrek, can I use the restroom real quick? I gotta go poop.
Excuse me, where is the toilet? The toilet is over there.
Appreciate that.
Don't you dare pissing on the walls.
I'm not! I gotta take a dump anyway! Dude, with the door noise. Yo, we're going down. I'm sorry. Oh my goodness, there's residual toilet paper. There's no toilet seat. Somebody left residual toilet paper to cover it up. Do you see it? That is disgusting! Okay, I did not get a dirty. Chat, I did not get a dirty. What are you looking at me like that for? I didn't do nothing! Shrek! Oh my god, you just killed me. Alright, I'm gonna go to
Nom nom nom.
If I see one more vending machine with only drinks in it, I'm actually gonna lose my mind. Yo, CJ with 5 gig, appreciate you. We survived night 1 at Shrek's Hotel. Why is he...
His trail was like gone.
Yeah. That was the laggiest